want you to beat these gentlemen to death now.
Yo, what the f? That was so up, you guys.
Oh yeah, it is so good to be back with the most diabolical show on TV as we are breaking down the first episode of The Boys Season 4, Episode 1, titled Department of Dirty Tricks. Full spoilers ahead. We open with Victoria celebrating some new victories on the Singer Newman campaign on their path of winning the election. Meanwhile, the boys are there and ready to take down the soon-to-be vice president. Cut to seeing the crew setting their plan into motion as we see Butcher's symptoms from taking V last season are only getting worse as he's throwing up and getting closer to his expiration date. Now you notice that he looks off to the side and he's talking to someone that isn't there, which we'll be discussing a little bit later, but he tells Frenchie and Kimiko that he's fine. Now the boys are prepared to commit treason with their inside connect to get access to Victoria's personal belongings to take her out, as we see Butcher's health puts him on lookout and him being sidelined for any potential action. As we cut to the best villain on TV, Homelander, who's taking a piss and he notices a white pubic hair down there and he looks concerned. Now we later learn that he's actually aging, but that's not going to stop Homelander from setting his plans into motion and taking over the world. Now we see Homelander and Ryan's relationship is continuing to grow as Ryan is afraid to be in a big room with other people, as we see his dad cheers him up by reminding him that
About this, they're only humans and toys for our amusement. That's right.
Showing Ryan being nervous to be around other people showed me that he still has effects from being kept tucked away in private with his mom from all those years. Now Homelander wasn't expected to be in attendance and catches everyone by surprise, including Victoria. As she sends her daughter and Ryan to get some ice cream, we see Homelander tells them,
Does nobody come back pregnant? I'm just kidding.
Now Victoria tries to play cool around Homelander and doesn't want any of his endorsements, especially with the trial going on. But Homelander, being Homelander, does what he does best, and that is forcing his way into the situation and makes it seem that him and Victoria are on the same page to the press. I have a feeling that the back and forth between these two characters are going to be epic this season. Meanwhile, against MM's orders, we see Billy makes his move towards Ryan and tries to convince him to leave with him to honor his mom's last wishes, which is to keep him safe, but also to keep him away from Homelander. Which, speaking of, he enters the room and tells Billy,
No means no, William. This isn't the Neverland Ranch.
As we see Homelander mocks Butcher after using his x-ray vision to see the mass on Butcher's brain, which is killing him. Now, even though we see Ryan leaves with his dad, there was a look of concern on his face when he heard that Butcher was dying, which to me kind of points towards this season planting the seeds that Ryan will most likely turn on his dad and probably rejoin Butcher at some point. Now back to the mission to kill Victoria, we see Frenchie and Kimiko head into a room and places what we later learn to be acid as they replace this with her eye drops, but her daughter Zoe comes in and uses her new powers of tentacles with very sharp teeth that come out of her mouth as she brutally kills the guards. Now Zoe starts to attack Frenchie, but Kimiko steps in only to get her arm ripped into pieces, but she manages to kick Zoe off of her. As they rush to an exit, Starlight tells them where to jump out for she can try to catch them, but Kimiko misses because her arm is now growing and it almost reminded me of the baby arm from Deadpool 2, which was hilarious, as Starlight only manages to catch Frenchie, but Kimiko lands right on her face, leaving a bloody mess, but she's okay. While all that was happening, Veronica finds Hughie in the van. As Hughie calls her out for turning her daughter into a monster, as he puts it, but she felt it was the right call in order to keep her safe. As they reminisce about old times back in season 2, back when they were close friends, we see Vic admits that she did care for him, but we see that Hughie was only stalling as he throws what I assume was what was in the eye drops, which was acid, but that does nothing to her. Now Hughie threatens to out her information from the Red River, but she reminds him that if he tries to out her out, she'll make sure to kill everybody he's ever loved. As Vic tries to make a truce with him, but Butcher comes behind her and shoots her in the head, and yet again, it has no effect. Now after a failed assassination, getting into a fight with her daughter, throwing acid into her face, and shooting her in the back of the head, this got me thinking, why on earth is she keeping them alive? Because we all know she could have easily popped off their heads, but I think she's playing the long game and keeping them alive for a backup plan against Homelander, because why else would she not kill them? Now after this failed mission, Butcher and MM meet up with Grace, but she doesn't let Billy in and she tells him,
There are people who, because of ignorance or maybe insanity, still believe you have something to contribute.
As we see Butcher tells her that he promises to get Ryan back. Now, to my surprise, we find out the soon-to-be newly appointed president was the one behind the assassination. Now, we find out in this scene that MM is now in charge of the boys as he gets his orders to not screw up again and taking out Newman by any means necessary. Now, I could be wrong, but what if that intel that MM got, the bad intel, was actually from Victoria herself? What if she gave them misinformation to find out who's trying to kill her? Now, it also wouldn't surprise me if Victoria is playing clueless to Singer for now, but once he's in office, she'll most likely kill him to go from vice president to president. Now, outside with Butcher, we officially meet Jeffrey Dean Morgan's character, who goes by the name of Joe Kessler. As they catch up and talk about old times, we see Billy tells him that he'll be back as the leader of the boys in a matter of time, and he also shares that he feels as though Grace's focus shouldn't be on Newman, but on Homelander, especially after killing someone in public and getting an applause from the crowd. Now, Joe brings up what happened at the finale with Butcher stopping Soldier Boy from killing Homelander and questions if Billy's priorities are actually straight. Now, regardless of Butcher's mistake, we see Joe tells him how much he's needed before the Supes decide to take over. Now, switching focus on the main plot and talking about the side plots in this episode, which honestly I found to be the weakest part of this premiere. Now, starting with MM, he learns that his daughter is acting out in school as well as at home after Todd had left and his ex wants him to find Todd. Which later in the episode, we see MM, Frenchie, and Kimiko tagging along with him to find Todd, which they do, and we'll tie that back at the end. Now, honestly, I hope that there's a lot more to MM this season because I'm a big fan of that character. Now, besides him dealing with the aftermath of what actually happens to Todd in this episode, I really do hope that they let him lead the team for most of the season before inevitably giving the leadership up back to Billy. Now, besides the opening, the boys aren't really that much together in this episode, and we get to see that the team wants Butcher gone, but Hughie's the only one that disagrees. So it's going to be interesting to see how long Hughie's going to defend Butcher for the rest of the season, and if they're going to inevitably kick him out of the boys. Now, the plot that I felt was very underwhelming and just kind of random was seeing Starlight wanting to rebrand herself as Annie and Frenchie's new love interest. Now, at Starlight's headquarters, we see Annie really doesn't want to use the Starlight persona anymore, and she wants to use her powers for better after quitting the Seven in last season. Now, for most of this episode during Starlight scenes, the show would cut to this social media influencer Soup by the name of Firecracker, who's said to be a parody of the X-Men character Jubilee. Now, Firecracker could be seen in the trailers of this new season, and it appears that she probably eventually joins the Seven at some point, and maybe she becomes the replacement of Starlight, and seeing her calling Starlight out on social media might set up this beef between the two characters. Now, talking about Frenchie, we see that he recommended an old friend by the name of Colin, who he met at AA, as he's now a volunteer at the Starlight house, and we see that they had a past relationship, and Kimiko sees this as well. And last but not least, we have the Hughie plot. Now, his dad is taken to the hospital in this episode after suffering a stroke, and Hughie feels bad because he was ignoring his call throughout the episode as he sits by his bedside for most of the second half of this premiere. Now, clearly, this is just the first episode, and they're laying the groundwork for what's to come, but the way it was presented just felt like it lacked a punch, it lacked a flair. It felt like these characters were just repeating similar storylines from the previous season, and it just felt like they were going through the motions. Now, if you've been watching my breakdowns of all the seasons of The Boys, I've personally never been the biggest fan of the Hughie character. Now, I understand the purpose of the character. He's pretty much the audience point of view and being thrown to the chaos, but I've always felt that his arc ended back in season 2. Now, the same thing could be said about Frenchie, who, by the way, I like him as a character, but the show just sometimes doesn't seem to know what to do with him. So we'll see what happens with MM and Starlight. I'm going to be optimistic. Again, I know this is the first episode. These are just side plots, and they're going to probably get better. But again, I just felt like whenever we cut to these side characters and these side plots, you felt the show's momentum slow down drastically. Now, bringing it back to the main plot, we see Homelander having a nightmare about terrible things that he's done over the past 4 seasons, but we get these really quick shots of some red metal door and this woman screaming. Now, was that red door and the woman somehow a part of his past when he was being experimented on, and was that woman his mom? As we get a glimpse of his day-to-day routine, we see that he's clearly bored of it all. From his trial, to meeting at VOT, to watching Annie talking bad about him on television, we see him sitting in on a meeting held by Ashley with the remaining members of the Seven, as they're watching a TV interview with the Deep as he's discussing this octopus relationship that's a controversy right now, and we get a very hilarious Amber Heard joke.
By a jilted and emotionally unstable, hysterical woman. who, let's be clear, pooped in my bed.
Now, for those like myself who watched Gen V, we get our very first reference to the end events of the finale as Ashley thanks Homelander for saving her from the massacre at Godolkin University. Now, Ashley informs Homelander that the board thinks that it's time to recruit new members to join the Seven. But before moving on, can we talk about and start to get the theories going in the comments below? Who in the hell is the new Black Noir? Because obviously we know in season 3 that Homelander killed him. Now, I know a lot of people in my comment section of my Gen V breakdowns thought that Sam would probably be the new Black Noir, but I was never in that camp. As we'll later discuss, we actually hear the voice of the new Black Noir, and that clearly isn't Sam, and it's also someone that I don't think we've heard their voice before. As Homelander dismisses half of the candidates Ashley brings up, we see Sister Sage, who is the smartest person in the world, being talked about. Now, Homelander is just so tired of being around idiots, as he puts it, but he wants to prove a point as he calls an audible and tells the Deep to pleasure A-Train, and he's not joking. As we see, A-Train is told to stand up, he takes his pants down, the Deep goes up to him and he says,
Sex is just a spectrum, right, bro?
I thought it was so funny seeing Ashley loving every single second of that, but we see Homelander stops this and tells them that nobody has the balls to actually challenge him and tell him no. Now again, comment below your thoughts, your theories, and your predictions on who the new Black Noir is, and for my comic book fans, I don't think it's who you all think it might be, but we'll save that for another discussion. But more importantly, if Homelander didn't stop the Deep, do you all think that he would have did what he requested? We have this secret meeting taking place as Butcher called Newman to discuss how they can help one another. Now, Butcher wants her help in getting Ryan back, but we get yet another Gen V reference as he tells her that he knows about the soup-killing virus that was made at Godolkin in that first season of Gen V. Now, the deal is that he'll keep her filled in on any action coming her way from the boys or the CIA, and in return, she'll give him access to the virus to make it stronger to take out Homelander and eventually get Ryan back. Now, before the agreements takes place, she wants him to get information from Hughie about what he has on her from the Red River files as a sign of good faith, and we see that he gets this information later in the episode by stealing it off of Hughie. As Homelander continues to pluck his white pubic hairs and puts it in a glass jar, which by the way, is him keeping this some type of weird souvenir, or is he doing this for something else and maybe creating a better version of himself? As Homelander looks over the candidates, he keys in on Sister Sage. Now, the most shocking moment and honestly the most oddest moment of this entire episode is seeing Homelander in street clothes as he pays a visit to Sage. He makes her show him how smart she is as she calls out all his insecurities by just taking one look at him. Which, by the way, is exactly what he was looking for earlier in the meeting, for someone to step up and not be afraid to call him out. Now, we find out in this scene that Homelander is indeed aging, but he's also going through an existential midlife crisis. Now, Homelander needs some advice for her, as she can tell that he isn't happy, even though he has all the things to his disposal in the world. Now, this becomes a bit of a therapy session for Homelander and her, as he asks her if she was him, what would she do if she was the most powerful being on Earth, and what would she do if she was in his situation? Now, before leaving, Homelander tells her that he wants her to join the Seven, and if she does join the Seven, he wants to put her skills to practice, and he'll listen to her on his path on taking rule on a global scale with her by his side. Now, Sage does accept Homelander's offer, and the first thing that she does is gathering his most devoted fans, and that includes Todd. Now, this fan meetup isn't exactly what they were hoping for, as we see Homelander has Deep, Black Noir, and A-Train get baseball bats, and he wants them to beat them to death, which we see them do, and we see Todd ends up getting murdered in the process. Now, as they're told to wait for further instructions by Sister Sage, we see that Black Noir tells them what's on his mind. Now, we end this episode with seeing Homelander's verdict being not guilty, as Sage sets off a fight between the Homelanders and the Starlighters. Now, was it me, or did this scene kind of feel off? Like, the pacing, the stakes, the characters that were involved, it just didn't work for me. Like, from seeing Frenchie kissing Colin in the middle of this fight to seeing Annie's friend getting beat up, I get the point of the scene, but I just thought the execution was just poor. Now, the plan is set as the 3 dead bodies are planted by A-Train in the middle of this fight to make it look like they were killed in the process of this accident, as we see the Starlighters are being blamed for these murders. Now, MM saw Sage at the fan meetup, and he's able to put 2 and 2 together, and he knows that she was involved, and now he's going to have her eyes on her for the rest of this season. Now, at Homelander's penthouse, we see Ryan going back to the start of this episode and tells his father that he doesn't want Butcher to die, as Ryan brings up that his mom loved him, and Homelander tells him,
What about you?
Now, I want to go back and talk about what Homelander said to Ryan before that, and what did he mean exactly when he said,
Do everything together until we almost merge into one.
Now again, with the whole secret stash of his pubes, but also this whole idea of him setting the stage of taking over the world, Is Homelander thinking about creating a better version of himself? Now we see the Deep has actually kept his octopus lover in his closet as they plan to escape one day. By the way, I don't know if you all know and stuck around to the end credits, but the person that plays the voice of the octopus is the one and only Tilda Swinton. We cut to Frenchie, who's weirded out from seeing a photo from Colin and his family, which makes me think that something happened in their past, either directly with Colin or someone of his family, so it's going to be interesting to see where that goes. Which, speaking of family, we see Hughie with his dad, who's recovering from his stroke. As he's saying his goodbyes, his mom just pops up out of nowhere, which we know back in season 1, Hughie said that he hasn't been around his mom in years, so it's going to be interesting to see that new dynamic. And by the way, the credits revealed that his mom is being played by Rosemary DeWitt, so it's going to be really interesting to see if she's a good mom, a bad mom, and more importantly, where has she been this whole time? Now, at the very end, it's revealed that Billy was talking to Rebecca this whole time throughout the episode. Now, this hallucination version of Rebecca tells Butcher that there's a better way of figuring things out than just screwing over his friends, but he tries to tell her that it's too late, but she disappears. Now, I don't know if she's going to reappear throughout the rest of the season or if it's the last time we're going to see that character, but he ends up making the right decision as he sends the files over to Newman only for her to open it up to find someone's butthole. After what I considered to be a subpar season opener, episode 2 came back with a vengeance and really fleshed out things and really set the stage for what's to come this season. From the crazy cameos to the salad tossing, it is time to break down this episode. Spoilers ahead. We open with a heartbreaking award-winning scene from the A-Train movie starring himself but also starring Will Ferrell. A hilarious moment and a very welcome cameo from an actor I'm a fan of, as this show just continues to poke fun of the stereotypical Hollywood tropes, and this being an example of the white savior. Now, after A-Train gets notes from his great director Adam, we see Black Noir speaks yet again and asks A-Train if being told to murder people by Homelander is a normal routine as being a part of the Seven. Now, as this unknown Black Noir replacement is trying to find his character's motivations, but we see A-Train just basically tells him to shut up and just do as he's told. Now, technically Black Noir is still being played by the same actor that's played the character for the entire show, but now he actually has a speaking part, but I do wonder if his mask is removed yet again, if we'll see a new actor playing the role. Now, like I did with my episode 1 breakdown, we're going to be taking a detour from the A-plot and take a moment to break down the subplots in this episode. Starting with Annie, who's watching the news as they continue to push the narrative that her supporters were responsible for the 3 dead bodies found in episode 1. Now, of course, the media pushes it that there are 2 black men that were responsible for those murders, as we see Annie making a statement by the end of this episode, but I'll be honest, the whole will she, won't she be a superhero angle and take the mantra of being Starlight again isn't all that interesting for me so far. Now, Hughie has to deal with his mom in this episode as he learns that she actually works for Vought, and we see that even though she left them when he was only 6 years old, his dad actually updated his will for his mom to be the power of attorney, giving her control over medical decisions. Now, Hughie also learns that his parents have actually been in touch for the last few years without his knowledge, as he tries to practice what he's going to say to her for this whole episode, which comes back at the end. Now, Frenchie and Colin have a reveal that we'll tie up at the end of this video, but we see what Kimiko will be dealing with this season, as she's forced to go to therapy to confront her past, but she hates every second of it, and she ultimately decides to leave. Now, throughout this episode, on the boys being on their mission to get intel for Sage, we see that Kimiko is reminded by the kidnapping signs about her situation in her past as she was a kid that was trained to kill. Now, as that's going on, she almost blows her cover by getting drunk, but looks to be on this search at the end of this episode to find her monsters. Now, Butcher finally tells the boys that he's dying, and we see MM giving him some tough brotherly love as he pulls him to the side and tells him to pack his bags and leave, and if he doesn't, he'll force him to do so. Now, speaking of MM, he briefs the team about Todd's death and Sage connection as they set their sights on her for this week's mission. Now, back to the main plot, we have a meeting being held for Ryan's new superhero origin story and the blueprints for his superhero suit, which happens to look identical to his dad's. Now, Ryan clearly isn't excited, and Sage notices this and she shares her 2 cents on marketing Ryan differently considering that he's the first naturally born soup. Now, she's actually prepared Ryan's first save, which does include Homelander, which he doesn't like, but she reminds him that it's all a part of his plans to build his legacy and his empire. But she also lets everyone in the room know, including CEO Ashley, that she's here for Homelander because he trusts her. Yeah, this whole dominance, I'm smarter than you because she is the smartest person in the world, I think it will eventually run its course with Homelander, and it's just a matter of time before he changes his mind about her ideas and probably tries to kill her, but it wouldn't surprise me, and I have this feeling that she's actually probably 10 steps ahead of him, and most likely recorded the murders of those 3 fans, and she'll probably use that as blackmail against Homelander if he ever threatens her. I'm really liking what they're doing with the Sage storyline so far and her relationship with Homelander, and I'm really excited to see where it goes. Now, after displaying her new position in front of Ashley tries to give her advice on how to speak to Homelander, as we see Sage immediately fires back and tells Ashley not to worry about her, but more about herself and her hiding her boldness. But Sage isn't done giving advice after watching Ashley not only deny the Deep for helping Ryan in his first save, but she also calls him an idiot in front of his face without hesitation. Now, Sage asks him why did he just allow that to happen and reminds him that that is a human and that he's superior and that he should actually not listen to her and go to Ryan's first save. So I could be wrong, but I think some of my thoughts may come true, where I can definitely see that she's either an undercover agent with the CIA with Grace without the boys knowing, or she's doing this on her own and she wants to take down Vought, or maybe take over Vought by herself and just tear them down from the inside out. Now, we get some behind the scenes of how Ryan's first save will go, and of course it's staged, but it was just so funny seeing the rehearsals and Homelander's reactions, the Deep, all of it to me was just so great comedic timing, and the icing on top was yet again Black Noir forgets that he's not supposed to talk. Now we see the Deep take Sage's advice and he confronts Ashley and actually scares her. Now I think this newfound confidence might backfire on Deep. He might try to talk to Homelander like that and he might find out really quickly who to talk to and who not to talk to like that. Which, speaking of Homelander, he overhears the marketing department talking about how great it is to work with someone young and not having to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to make them look good with VFX. This to me is another example of Homelander being told that he's aging and that his best days are behind him. Now again, I believe that there's going to be some type of twist from the comics reveal which involves a clone and Homelander, but I think instead of for him not being knowledgeable of that or not having his consent about a clone, I think that Homelander is going to have a big part in making a better version of himself and recreating himself with a clone. Now back to this week's mission, we have Kimiko, and Frenchie who are caught by surprise to find Butcher crashing their mission, which is to find Sage at this Truth Con, which is a con that's going to reveal all the conspiracies that this particular group of people are obsessive over. Now Sage is at this con to watch Firecracker's panel, which is set to prove Starlight is a monster and that she's in cahoots with Oprah and Tom Hanks to traffic people to her loyal supporters. We see Frenchie and Kimiko follow Firecracker's biggest supporter as he's in the steam room, and as he's in the steam room, they see that he gets a message to get invited to a secret meeting that's taking place later that night. But what they find is something that I wasn't expected to see on television anytime soon in my lifetime, and that is an insane scene as they find out that this supporter is a soup that can duplicate himself, as he is caught human centipeding himself to a picture of Firecracker. Man, I tell you, the creators of the show come up with the craziest things. What we just saw was not on my bingo card of things to watch today. Now back with Annie and Hughie, who were tasked to follow A-Train, who they know is responsible for dropping off the bodies. Now they find A-Train hanging out with his young nephews as he gets caught by his older brother, who calls him out for staging all of his saves and calls him a liar and he's never been an actual hero. Now to me, this scene definitely kind of sets up the stage for A-Train having his redemption arc. Now we've seen this arc somewhat in the previous seasons, but I think they're going to fall through with that in this particular season, and we actually see him doing that in this episode as he later gives them evidence proving that the Starlighters are innocent as a thank you for not doing anything when he was being spied on talking to his family. Now back at the Truth Con, we see Sage is definitely there for her recruiting process as she wants to know what exactly Firecracker is selling, as she tells her that she's selling purpose. Now after hearing that, she invites her to the secret meeting as well. Now for he gets the intel that he wanted, but that's not enough for Butcher. He wants to handle things differently, which leads to them going outside, and we see that Butcher is pushing MM's buttons, which leads him to punching him in the face as he mentions his wife. But at the end of the day, it looks like Butcher was right. As the boys are setting up their surveillance cameras for this secret meeting, they end up getting caught by Sage, who's with Firecracker and her followers, as this was all a ruse because she knew that she was being tailed, and she isn't impressed by the boys after knowing what their reputation is. As she tells Firecracker if she kills them, she'll get her a chance to actually meet Homelander. Now to add more fuel to my theory of her working with the CIA or working for herself, why didn't she stay in a room and watch them actually kill the boys? I think she 100% knew that the boys would make it out alive, again going back to that line, but she just didn't want to blow her cover. But again, I could be 100% 100% wrong on that angle, but I have a feeling that she definitely has something up her sleeve. Now, of course, Firecracker and her followers are a bunch of amateurs, and as soon as Sage leaves, they get into a fight with the boys, as we actually get to see Duplicate Soup in action. Man, you gotta love the product placement in this episode, from the Amazon boxes in Ryan's rehearsal, to Frenchie and MM accidentally crashing a bar mitzvah that is themed for the marvelous Mrs. Maisel, which of course is on Amazon Prime. Now, surprisingly, the boys are losing this crazy fight as we see Firecracker going live with her audience to show them that they're under attack, but in comes Butcher, who comes in and gets into this fight that she was looking for earlier with MM. Now, Butcher ends up getting surrounded, but the boys help him and return the favor, as we see Billy ends up killing the Prime version of the duplicate, which actually kills the rest of them. But I don't know why they let Firecracker go. That to me is a mystery. Why not keep her, question her, or even kill her? Again, it's a mystery to me. AKA, she's got plot armor so far in the show. Now, before we wrap up and talk about the ending, we got lights, camera, action, as it is time for Ryan's big moment. But of course, his dad, Homelander, steps in to make sure that America and the world knows that he's here to help. But his presence throws off the whole scene as he forces Ryan to do the throw. But unfortunately, Ryan throws the stuntman too hard and he kills him, as Ryan has no idea how to react to his second accidental kill after his mother. But the question is, what will the public say about Ryan killing this guy? Will there be a pushback, or will Vought just cover this up as usual? Now, we end this episode with Ryan crying about what just happened to his dad, Homelander, as he tries to cheer him up in the only way he knows how. But he is surprised to learn why Ryan is upset, and that is because he just killed a human. Now, Homelander uses the "only humans are toys" line again, and he tells him why does he care so much about the humans and killing the humans. He is the chosen one, and it's just a matter of time before he has to accept that sooner rather than later. Now, to me, the writing is clearly on the wall that Ryan's going to make a switch to go against his dad, but I'm curious to have this conversation with you all in the comments below. Should the show be making the switch so soon, or would you all, like myself, wish that the show maybe had shown Ryan leaning more into his dad's perspective before making what I think to be a switch against his dad? But speaking about his dad and Homelander, him pushing Ryan to be essentially the mini version of him, with Ryan not going down that path, which seems to be the way that the show is heading, will we see Homelander try to kill his own son, and again, try to create his own 2.0 Homelander? Now, we also see Annie and Hughie using the evidence to free those men who were framed for the murder, as we see Annie is now ready to embrace the Starlight persona again, which pleases the crowd. Now, we do find out that Frenchie does indeed have a dark past with Colin after calling Cherry. We actually learn that he murdered his entire family, which would explain why he was so weirded out at that photo at the end of episode 1, but it also explains why Colin was in AA. You'll remember in that photo, he was graduating, so one would assume after he lost his family, he went down a path of drugs and alcohol. As Hughie finally confronts his mom after practicing his response to her saying that she'll handle the situation with his dad, as he also confronts her about leaving him as a kid, as he tells her that he will take her to court if she refuses to let him be a part of the decisions moving forward. Something's telling me it's more complicated than what Hughie thinks. Maybe his dad wasn't a good husband, or something on the lines where there's some type of secret being kept between both of his parents. As our last scene shows Kimiko going on her path of revenge from the ones who made her into a killer, we see Butcher and MM try to make up in their own brotherly way, as Butcher gives him advice on what it takes to be a leader, as he says to MM. Now, Butcher's dying wish is that he can get Ryan back safely and needs MM help, but unfortunately it's too little too late.
Now, who wants their balls crushed?
Me? I know I certainly don't, but I do want to talk about the best episode of the season so far. From seeing Final Destination on ice to a Transformer 2 reference, it's time to break down this episode. Spoilers ahead. We open with Homelander looking at the Starlight supporters in attendance, and you can just see the look on his face, and you just know he's getting closer and closer to his breaking point, but he holds it in for now, at least at this Vault conference. As Homelander says to his supporters, warning them for what the other side wants.
They want to get rid of superheroes. They want to get rid of me. And then they want to replace you with some godless, non-binary socialist.
As he introduces the current members of the Seven, and he also introduces the two new members, Firecracker and Sister Stage. As he lets everyone know that there's an opening spot for Ryan potentially, who he brings on stage and forces him to smile. Meanwhile, Butcher gets his plan in place with the help of Joe, who gives him something strong enough to put Ryan to sleep and take him under their control to stop Homelander. As the newest member of the Seven, Firecracker isn't waiting to make her presence felt as she talks to the media and shares her thoughts about what's being given to the Starlighters.
Did you know that these quote-unquote vaccines that they're giving out at the Starlight House actually cause autism.
As crazy as she may sound, Sage reassures Homelander that including Firecracker will only benefit his main goals. Seriously, the back and forth with Sage and Homelander is the best dynamic of the season so far, as they talk about her super suit, which she initially refused to wear, to him talking about the popularity being a power. Let's just make a bet in the comments right now. Who's going to be the first one to turn on the other and go rogue? Is it Sage or is it Homelander? Let me know in the comments below. Now, focusing on the side plots of this week's episode, we have Annie is officially back as Starlight as she watches her #1 fan, Firecracker, give a hate speech against her, which we can see is getting under her skin, which we finally learn why she hates her so much a little bit later on in this episode. Now, we have Frenchie trying to talk to Colin early on in this episode, but that's interrupted by a Firecracker supporter who's under the impression that there's kids in the basement who needed to be saved, as we see Frenchie takes care of him with ease. But on a serious note, the show is crazy and ridiculous, has some really crazy moments, but it is unfortunately true that there are people out there like this gentleman who drink the Kool-Aid and actually buy into the propaganda that they feed on. Now, Frenchie does get that alone time that he wanted with Colin, but instead of telling him the truth, he digs himself a deeper hole by making out with him. Meanwhile, Kimiko takes the wrong advice from her therapist and tells Frenchie her plans to face her past by finding and killing her enemies from her past, as she convinces him to tag along by putting the safety of the kids over her vengeance. Later in this episode, they do find that location, but Frenchie is under the influence, and as she's killing these men, he's tripping out and seeing the craziest and most random things as this is happening. Now, during this fight, Frenchie has a daydream of Colin, who's spending time with his dead family, which we see some pretty dark stuff as we see all the victims he's killed over the years. Man, I didn't realize how dark and how bad his past was, but again, like I've said before, the theme of these characters facing their past has been a central part so far, and it's been done pretty well. After killing most of the men, Kimiko comes across this woman who knows her but immediately starts fighting her until Frenchie steps in and makes her run away. Now, my question is, who is this mystery woman? One would assume that it might be someone that's related to Kimiko, and it might be even her sister. Now, last but not least with the side plots, we have MM telling the boys that he wants A-Train to join them by turning him into an informant. Now, tying that all into the main plot, we have Victoria getting a front seat to what some of her president's new administration will include, which is banning of the soups having any participation in the military, policing, and all other government positions, as he views the soups as
soups are entertainers, period. End of story.
And we see Victoria smiles and pretends to be on board. Yeah, what I said back in episode 2 of her having to kill the president seems to be more likely and happening sooner rather than later, but after what we learn in this episode, she won't have to do any of the heavy lifting. Now, back at Homelander's penthouse, we see Ryan plays the game Tournament of Heroes as Ryan gets a request from her friend, and it's Butcher. First off, the fact that they created a video game to frame this scene as a way to move the story forward was so clever to me, and honestly, I would pay to play this game. As we see, Butcher is planting the seeds for him and Ryan to meet up later in this episode. As we see, the frustration and ticking time bomb of Homelander is ramping up as he's watching Starlight at a press conference and mentions the power or lack of power that Homelander and Vought have, and you see her mentioning that is just inching away at him. Now we see Firecracker lets Homelander know that she is willing to do anything to please him, and he knows exactly what she meant. You see the new Black Noir is in the need of answers and direction from Ashley on what his role is on his team, but the running joke of being told to shut up hasn't gotten old for me. But speaking of old, Homelander tells Ashley that she's no longer to be a part of these meetings for the Seven, and that Sage is basically the new CEO. And it was just so funny as she's taking the walk of shame and dropping her things and is told that she's now the company mascot, aka Ronald McDonald of Vought. It had me dying laughing. Now Sage fills the Seven in on the video coverage proving that the Starlighter supporters were innocent, as Deep is no longer in charge of the crime analytics, and he hides this from his octopus lover later in this episode. We have Butcher mixing the drugs that Joe gave him into cookies and claims them as Rebecca's famous recipe, as Ryan has arrived and Butcher tries to convince him to stay. Now I'm not gonna lie, obviously having context of what Butcher's trying to do, but it doesn't make it less creepy. Now he does convince Ryan to stay by inviting him to play a game of foosball. Now during this game, they both open up to each other as Butcher mentions his deceased brother, and we see Ryan opens up about the accident that just recently happened. Now Butcher tells Ryan that he's a bad man and he doesn't know the first thing about looking after a kid. Now ultimately Butcher does the right thing and he goes against what he would have done back in season 1 by drugging Ryan, but we see that he throws the cookies away. Now A-Train is under the belief that he's going to make up with his brother as he gets a message from him only to find out that it was MM. Now, this is exactly what I was talking about a couple episodes ago when I said that I want to see MM taking charge, because he's just great at really framing the situation and setting up A-Train and playing to his guilt, and MM's just got away with words, and he's just great with talking to people. Now, A-Train doesn't make the turn quite yet because he's not ready to die after Sage found that footage, so playing the hero can get him killed, but MM reminds him that,
"But you're still standing here."
Now, back at Vought, they interview someone that they believe was involved with the footage and someone that's connected to Annie, and just as this young lady is talking about what the conversation entailed with Annie, Homelander lasers her right in the head, killing her. Now, as messed up as that was, and it was messed up, but from a story perspective, at least A-Train won't be a suspect anymore, as we see Ashley gets rid of her letter saying that she was going to quit Vought. Now, Annie confronts Firecracker by sneaking into her room, and she asks her why does she hate her so much. As we find out that these two characters actually had a past together, they used to be in the same pageant circuit back when Firecracker went under the name Sparkler. Firecracker has held this grudge against Annie for years after Annie told everyone that she slept with the judges, and Annie also told her,
I don't talk to fat sluts.
which forced her to quit. Now, this doesn't change anything in my perspective as far as Firecracker being a POS, but from a story point, I like her character's motives of being embarrassed when she was a little kid has fueled her into making the 7th. Now, back with the boys, Hughie and MM are the only ones in attendance for this very secret meeting between Homelander and Victoria, as MM was told about this from A-Train. But as this is going on, we get a glimpse of the boys on ice, which was just hilarious. We see Hughie is caught between a rock and a hard place as he's forced to stay in the vents as this meeting is taking place. Now, Sage tells Victoria what I said back in episode 1 of the killing of the president Singer, as they will do the heavy lifting, and if she becomes the president, all she has to do in return is
expand the Bureau of Superhuman Affairs, condemn the defund the soups movement, remove all books and teachers that teach critical soup theory, a hero in every town with legal authority over the police.
Now, Homelander, or should I say Magneto, really lays it on Vic about being afraid to come out as a soup. Now, I 100% had to suspend my disbelief in this scene because I thought it was ridiculous, as we see Hughie's sweat lands on Homelander's shoulder, and him not being able to get caught while he was moving in those vents, which clearly showed that it was very hard to not move and not be heard, before Homelander's lasers hit him was a stretch for me. But I will forgive it after what happens next. As we watch Hughie trying to run away from a very pissed off Homelander, we see MM gets a hold of the switchboard controlling the lights, which affects Homelander's lasers, as we see him slicing one of the skaters in half in a scene that looks straight out of Final Destination happens next. But my favorite part of this scene, and maybe one of my favorite moments of this season so far, we see Homelander closes in on Hughie, but he's too late because A-Train has saved Hughie. Now, what I love about this scene, I know a lot of you all remember this, we gotta appreciate this moment right now between these two characters, because you think about episode 1, and one of the first scenes of The Boys is when we saw A-Train killing Hughie's girlfriend, and for that to be full circle was just such a great moment. Now, this doesn't change much from Hughie, but to me, this is a great start for A-Train trying to apologize by saving his life. Now, we end this episode with Frenchie sharing a childhood story as he says,
"Man is condemned to be free because once thrown into this world, he's responsible for everything he does."
Now, we watch Frenchie refuses to tell Kimiko what's bothering him, and in return, she refuses to tell him who the identity of that girl was in the warehouse, which again, I'm assuming is some type of relative. We see Hughie going to check on his dad, and he has a heart-to-heart moment with his mother, and he just simply asks her, why did she leave all those years ago? As she tells him,
But it never went away.
But you were always so fun. We'd have dance parties.
I never wanted you to see it.
As she hid her depression all those years, and she tells him that one night she actually tried to take her own life, which she was unsuccessful in doing, but ultimately she decided to leave. Now, she tells Hughie that she tried to call him over the years, but his dad would stop any connection between the two because he didn't want any confusion, which I can understand, and she just eventually decided that it would be best to move on and not cause any more damage. Now, Joe is clearly upset with Butcher's decision not to drug Ryan, as he reminds him that time isn't on their side. Now, Joe gives Butcher two options. Either they get Ryan and train him to kill his own father, Homelander, or they find a way in killing Ryan. as our final moments show Sage and Deep bonding over Outback Steakhouse and Transformers 2, and one thing leads to another as we watch the smartest person in the world hooking up with maybe the dumbest. Now help me out in the comments below, but I have no idea what this bloody item is and what it means to either one of these characters. Maybe it's a device or an item that helps her really get in tune with her intelligent part of her brain, but again, I have no clue. As we see, Ryan returns home to a pissed off dad as Homelander just wants to know why he isn't enough. As he loses his cool and Ryan runs upstairs, we get the return of Mirror Mirror on the Wall, which is John versus Homelanders, as he says to himself,
"It's time to overcome this need for love, this sickness, once and for all. You're never gonna be your true self until you transcend your humanity. What do? You need to go back to the start."
As they tell him it's time to go home.
I'm so sorry.
Sorry? Al? Why? You were just doing your job, right? And I bet you would have won. I forgive you.
Now, I believe we just witnessed one of the most diabolical episodes of The Boys as Homelander strips away any remains of him seeking love from others as he takes a trip back home. Meanwhile, the master plan works to take down America's sweetheart as Butcher may or may not have mysterious powers, as it is time for us to break down this 4th episode of The Boys. Spoilers ahead. We open with where Homelander started as we see drawings of his original suit and various confidential emails from Vought on a bulletin board. As the security systems are down, the staff believes they have been breached as the elevator doors open and it's Homelander with a cake in his hands. Now Marty is the first to say hello as he's corrected after calling Homelander John. As Homelander puts on his happy face and pretends to be in a good mood as he says hello to the new and old faces and tells them to have some cake as he instructs them to call in one of the older members by the name of Barbara to celebrate this reunion. Now it's pretty clear that everyone in this room is clearly uncomfortable with Homelander being there, and it makes sense because they're probably fearful of their lives being taken away by the thing that they created. But I am curious to know, what exactly is the staff still doing in this department? Have they been testing to create another Homelander without his knowledge? Now at this point we're going to separate the rest of the breakdown by individual plots, starting with Frenchie and Colin. Now I don't know what Frenchie's angle ever was with getting back with Colin, but he asks Colin why he never talks about his family. Well, I'm thinking to myself, well, you know why, you idiot, because his family's dead. What else do you need to know? And you know this as well, but Colin tells him exactly what happened. Now we learned that Colin's mom was a federal judge and she was prepared to make an example out of Frenchie's boss, but she ordered the hit on them, and we also find out that Colin was actually in the house when that hit went down, but he was just hiding under his bed as his entire family was being murdered. Now the only thing that Colin saw was the ankles of the killers, and we find out that that was obviously Frenchie. Now I mentioned it in my breakdowns of episodes 1 and 3, but the Colin and the Frenchie plot is the weakest story of the season so far. To me, whenever we cut to them, it just comes off weightless. Like we just met Colin and I have no emotional connection to him or his family. And whenever he talks about his family, especially in this scene, it just comes off lifeless. Now, we'll tie this story up towards the end, but let's switch over and talk about what's going on with Hughie in this episode. He learns that his dad is just a mere days of passing away as they're labeling him as being brain dead soon, and they want to remove his feeding tube. Now Hughie doesn't want this to happen, but his mom doesn't stop this because she believes she wants the suffering to end for Hughie's father as we watch Hughie walk away. Now to the surprise of Kimiko, Hughie sets up a secret meeting between him and A-Train, who was expecting MM, as Hughie wants a dose of Compound V to save his father's life. Now while this meeting was going on, we see in the background that someone's taking pictures of this meeting, and we find out who that is in a little bit, but I'm not sure how they were able to track Kimiko. Did I miss something? Did they tag her in the fight that they got in the warehouse last week? That question was never answered in this episode. Now, A-Train tells Hughie that the V is hidden away in Homelander's penthouse and basically impossible to get without him noticing, but Hughie doesn't take no for an answer and tells him that he owes him in doing this after killing his girlfriend. Now A-Train agrees to help Hughie, and he tells him that if he helps, they'll be squared away. And listen, I get the angle that we're getting with Hughie, that he's desperate, that he's willing to do anything to save his father's life, and I also get that we're on this A-Train redemption arc, but I need a little bit more legwork for A-Train to now all of a sudden be willing to risk his own life with Homelander catching him taking a V in doing this to make up with Hughie. That to me is a bit of a stretch. Now meanwhile, we have some shots being fired at Kimiko and Hughie, and we find out that it's the same people that was spying on them, as it's the girl that we met at the warehouse who's also a part of the Shining Light group. Now during this scuffle, we see Hughie gets injured, and we see Kimiko has to patch up his injured ankle as she tells him he has to prepare prepared to fight for his life. Now we see Kimiko manages to take out a couple of the guys with ease until the mystery woman shoots Kimiko and actually splits her in half, leaving Hughie to fend for himself. Now when this happened, I thought to myself, oh, Hughie is gonna really have to figure out a way to survive, because I thought it was gonna take forever for Kimiko to heal, but as we'll find out later, it takes just a couple of seconds. Now Hughie goes toe to toe with one of the guys, and in a panicked state of mind, he manages to hold his own. Now he does get some cuts and bruises, but he ultimately kills this guy by cutting out his insides and also cutting his throat. Now I've said it before, I am not a Hughie fan, but I gotta call it like I see it, and I'm gonna give him his props. This scene was pretty badass. Now meanwhile, like I mentioned, I was wrong. Kimiko was able to heal pretty quickly as she fights this mysterious girl. Now Kimiko takes this girl down and holds out her hand as the girl doesn't want to take it, and she tells her that she doesn't remember. As we learn that when she was working for the Shining Light, Kimiko tricked this girl into getting kidnapped and they made her fight in this camp. Now this is yet another example of one of our main characters having to face their past and them being affected by their past. You can look at Frenchie, Hughie, Homelander, Starlight, and now Kimiko's main past is being revealed. Now yet again, we see our heroes allow the villains to live as Kimiko and Hughie walk away from the situation. Now, as it pertains to this plot, I can see it going a couple different ways. Number one, this mysterious woman will either continue to try to kill Kimiko, and I can see Frenchie being involved in the plot and Colin being involved, and Kimiko has to choose who's going to live, who's going to die. Or we're going to see Kimiko and this mysterious girl work together to take down the Shining Light group, and that can happen either this season to kind of end that arc, or they can carry it over to the last season. I mentioned A-Train earlier, so let's talk about what he's got going on in this episode. So he decides to finally go to Homelander's penthouse where he finds his secret stash of milk, but he also finds the V. Now he gets caught by Ashley, who he discovers left a surprise in Homelander's toilet. Now they both appear to have a problem, but they realize they share a dislike in Homelander, and I think it's pretty safe to say that we're going to probably see Ashley and A-Train working together for the rest of this season. Now before continuing, I will point out that we got yet another Gen V reference in this episode, as we see a commercial playing for the latest episode of The Whole Truth by Tech Knight, who's discussing the disappearance of the real heroes of the Godolkin Massacre. To me, it's just a matter of time before we get to see what was revealed in the marketing in the trailer of this season, which showed Kate and Sam will appear in this season of The Boys, and I have an idea how they're going to be used a little bit later in this video. Now Singer watches the news as they talk about the anti-hero law and how Vought is clearly against this, as Annie pays him a visit to address the new bill and possibly help with the marketing campaign to make sure it's passed, as she'll be in full Starlight form. Now in return, he promises that he'll finally put Vought into the ground, which is a perfect segue into Sage's main plans for Starlight. Now Sage goes over the next steps with the Vought marketing team and the members of the Seven to begin this smear campaign on Starlight. Now they plan on coming at her with a ton of damaging things that we see later in this episode, but we see that the Deep is head over heels for Sage and he wants to take her out on lunch, but she plays the I hate you card in front of the others, at least for now. Now Sage presents Firecracker with her final plans for Starlight, as Firecracker calls her one of the good ones, meaning that she's not like most black people, as Sage gives her a look and she walks away. Now again, I definitely think she's secretly working on something to take down the Seven, but I could be wrong, but let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Now we cut to the first episode with a live audience of the Truth Bomb with Firecracker, with special guests Kanye West and Starlight's old pastor Ezekiel. Now Annie clears out her headquarters to avoid the inevitable danger that's going to probably come from across the street as the boys arrive, and MM lets Annie know that he's brought Butcher back into the fold, and Annie is clearly pissed. I'm sorry, I gotta bring this up, but when did Butcher and MM essentially make up for MM to feel comfortable for Butcher getting back in the group? Now, I think we all knew inevitably Butcher was going to join, but I would have loved to have seen the scene or the moment where MM's like, you know what, it is what it is, come back, but we don't see that. Is it me, or did that bother you all? As I digress, we see Annie lies about knowing why Firecracker hates her, most likely because she's embarrassed about that story, as Butcher and MM plan to take down Firecracker at her show. Now at Firecracker's show, we get a duet between her and the Deep. Meanwhile, MM and Butcher sneak their way backstage. Now Butcher wants MM to save Ryan if he doesn't make it, and he wants him to raise him like he's his own, but we don't get an answer from MM in this scene, but I'm pretty confident that this scene may come back into play somewhere down the road. Now Now, MM and Butcher confront Firecracker as they tell her that they know about her secret sexual relationship with a 15-year-old when she was 28, as they have a drafted up tweet to expose her. Now, for all those people that were head over heels of Firecracker after the first 3 episodes, I got a question for y'all. How do you feel about her now? Do you still want to fix her? But as they tell her that they want to know everything about Sage's plan, or else they're going to tweet about her past, and as a surprise to me, as well as these characters, she hits the tweet button on her own as she tells them,
Send it myself. Fuck around and find out.
Now, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty confident that Firecracker knew that this was going to be exposed about her, because we know that she's working with Sage, who we know is the smartest person in the world, and this could be another example of her being 10 steps ahead of the boys. And also, they just know that her fans are idiots and they're going to believe anything she says, as we're about to find out in the next scene. Now, back on stage with Ezekiel, he does some extraordinary math to make it seem as though the letters in Starlight's name equal the number of Satan, as Firecracker returns and she confesses her sins about the situation, and that after that happened, she turned her life around. As she continues to go on, she eventually tells a story about Starlight's first save at 13 years old, as she accidentally blinded a mother of 3. Now, she tells the rest of the crowd and everyone watching on TV that Starlight was never a hero, and we see that Starlight's friend and Colin give her this look of shame. Now, this could be me, but the look that Colin and her friend gave her when they found out what happened when she was 13 was just ridiculous. Like, this look of shame is so stupid to me, because they didn't even blink an eye when they heard about Firecracker and that situation that she was in years ago, which was way worse in my opinion than what happened with Starlight. So let me know if y'all felt the same thing in the comment section. But as we move on, we see later in the episode, Frenchie is given the keys to Firecracker's trailer, and as he heads inside, he finds the tablet Sage gave her that showed the master plan to take down Starlight. Meanwhile, Firecracker reveals the final stage, which is 6 months ago Starlight was pregnant and she ended up deciding to get an abortion. Now, this is clearly the final straw for Annie, as Firecracker tells her audience,
Tell me that those teens over there, that they're safe with her, with that baby killer.
As we see Starlight makes her way across the street, and she has no words for Firecracker, but instead she just starts beating her ass. While that's happening, we see Frenchie get caught by Ezekiel, and he gets beat up until Butcher steps in, and we see him freezes his arm and breaks it. Now, back on stage, we see Starlight continues to beat up on Firecracker as Sage watches this, and I kind of got a feeling that she was enjoying what was happening, both with Firecracker getting beat up for what she said earlier, but also not being a fan of Starlight. As MM stops Annie as she realizes this beating was captured on television and will most likely destroy her image, as Sage says,
First pebble down the mountain.
Now, back with Billy, he's almost about to die as Becca tells him to get up, but he can't, and out of nowhere, Ezekiel explodes without explanation. Now, something tells me that that little parasite inside of Butcher may have saved him in this exact moment, and it might be mutating inside of him. Now, after Colin tries to help Frenchie after getting beat up, he finally reveals what he did, and he tells him that he killed his family. As we watch Colin start to beat him up, punch him in the face, he's choking him, he's about to kill him, but he eventually stops, and he tells Frenchie to never talk to him again. Which I'm okay with, because I'm so tired of this storyline, but I'm pretty confident that that's not the last time we'll see Colin this season. Now, to spotlight the most evil and diabolical storyline of this episode, let's talk about Homelander's reunion. Now, Homelander challenges Frank to a game of waste paper basketball, and if he wins, he'll allow him to go home early. Simple enough. As Homelander explains the time he saw Frank playing this game, as he turned up the temperature on this human-made oven to try to burn Kid Homelander's skin off, as if this was just something normal on a regular day. As Homelander details, even though the oven didn't work, he was still in pain as he cried during those moments. Now, Frank tells him he was just doing his job, as Homelander tells him that it was something that he never forgot. As he instructs Frank to get into this oven as he takes his last shot, and if he refuses to go in, he's going to bring his family and have him join him in this oven, as we watch Frank enters and he begins to apologize. Now, Homelander reminds him he was just doing his job, as he cuts on the machine and Frank burns alive, and all is forgiven. At this point in this episode, it was pretty clear that Homelander was trying to eradicate all the remains of his humanity. Now, if you thought that was bad, let's talk about what happens next. Now, Homelander calls over Marty to apologize for Frank, and he accepts his apology. Now, Marty reminds Homelander that, yeah, he was the good guy. He was the one that was nice to Homelander when he was a kid, until Homelander reminds him of the nickname he gave him after he caught young Homelander, or young John, pleasuring himself, which really hurt Homelander's feelings. Now, Marty apologizes, but Homelander wants to get a laugh out of him, and he wants him to pleasure himself in front of everyone in the room. Now, in perfect boys fashion, he proceeds to do the deed, and Homelander sits there and watches him and begins laughing. Now, of course, Marty isn't able to get himself excited, so Homelander tells him that if he doesn't get excited, he's gonna laser his private part off. Okay, to me, and let me know how you feel about this in the comments, this was easily one of the most ridiculously disturbing scenes of the show so far, as Marty can't do it and Homelander goes ahead and does what he promises and lasers him. The laugh that Antony Starr does as Homelander in this scene is stuff made out of nightmares and scary as hell as Barbara finally arrives. Now, Barbara wants Homelander to show him some mercy as she wants him to take him out of his misery as we watch Homelander smushes his head with his boot. Now, inside the room that Homelander will call the bad room, he talks to Barbara. She reminds Homelander that they were just following orders from the higher-ups, whether it was her, Stan, or Dr. Vinderbaum, as Homelander points out that none of them stopped what happened. As we hear about the day that Homelander was born, as he lasered his way out of his mother's stomach, killing her and floating in the air and killing everyone that was around, as everyone was terrified of Homelander since the very moment he was born. He tells him that the reason he doesn't leave was because
couldn't stand the idea that we would be disappointed in you.
Now, Barbara isn't fearful in this moment as she tells him he will never overcome his human side of seeking approval of being loved. But he tells her he's not human, he will raise Ryan to know that as well, as he wants to share with her why he called it the bad room. As we end the episode with Sage getting the food that Deep invited her to get earlier, and he's just as confused as to what's going on with her on and off switch as she explains the mysterious instrument from last week's episode. As she explains to Deep,
their brains grow till they're about 25, then stop forever. Mine doesn't, it regenerates constantly.
And now she wants Deep to perform this frontal lobotomy so that they can spend time together without being herself, and convinces him to do so after saying they're going to watch the sex tape of Kim and Ray J. Now, I'll be honest with you all, I have a personal ick about things going in people's eyes, so this scene just completely grossed me out. But the Deep and her hooking up, I got a question for you all. Is this a real thing from her perspective, or could the Deep be using her? That's something that I never really thought about. But when it comes to this relationship, do you genuinely think that she's into him, or is this a part of her plan? Either way, these scenes between these two characters are absolutely hilarious, and if I'm being honest, they have more chemistry and better chemistry than Hughie and Starlight have ever had in this show. Now, we see Newman is creating her narrative and distancing herself from Singer, who's working with Starlight after what happened in this episode. Now, speaking of Starlight, we see Singer calls her and breaks off the partnership that was developed earlier in this episode. I know since the beginning, the show has always positioned Annie as like the one true hero of the show, and we're finally getting some of her backstory as far as her secrets that she's kept all these years, but it's just not entirely working for me, if I'm being honest. Now, I could be wrong. I hope that the storyline really has a good payoff, and I wouldn't be surprised if Queen Maeve comes into the mix to get her back on track. Now, Hughie meets with A-Train to deliver the V to give to his dad, and we see Hughie actually takes this and he shakes A-Train's hand and forgives him, but he finds out that Butcher was there the whole time. Now, we know that this is a non-lethal version of the V, as Hughie offers this to Butcher before giving it to his dad. But we actually find out that Butcher took some V a couple months ago and it didn't work. Now, again, Butcher believes that the V didn't work, but I don't think he's lying in this moment. I don't think he actually knows that it probably is working, and what it's doing is he now has some type of power, as we saw with Ezekiel earlier, and his body's now just reacting to it. Now, Hughie ultimately decides against giving his dad the V, as he's coming to accept that his father's gonna pass. Now, Hughie gets a cup of coffee to get for him and his mom as he's preparing to say his goodbyes, but as we see on the monitor, it's starting to go off, and we see that this V is getting injected into his veins, and his vitals come back, and we see that his father's eyes are now open. Now, I could be reading the scene wrong, but I think it's pretty clear that Hughie wasn't the one that gave his dad the V. It was actually his mom, which the bigger question is, where does she get the V, and will his dad now have superpowers? As our last scene shows Homelander covered in blood, as we see he left Barbara in the bad room with all the remains of the staff. As it appears to me that any last bits of humanity that Homelander had was left in that bad room, and he's now a new and more powerful and diabolical version of himself.
That's war. No longer be beloved celebrities. You will be wrathful gods. When the time comes, will you answer the call?
Well, how do you follow up from last week's episode, which many, including myself, would consider to be the best episode of the season so far? Well, you take a trip down to the farm where some animals have to be put down. Which, speaking of putting down, we see Hughie has to make a tough decision as we get to experience the future of the VCU at V52. as it is time for us to discuss and break down episode 5 of season 4 of The Boys. Spoilers ahead. We open with taking a look back at all the Supes who paved the way for the current Supes as V52 Expo is here. As Homelander watches the opening of this event from the sidelines, we see he's still thinking about his recent return back home. As Sage asks Homelander how his visit was and gets no response, and for the first time we don't get our regular back and forth banter between the two, as she can just tell that something's off with him. As we watch her try to make small talk with Homelander, but again we can just tell that his mind's elsewhere. Now I gotta admit, I got a kick out of the shots being taken at studios, but mainly Disney and Marvel Studios in my eyes in this episode, as Deep and his co-host Cameron present the phases 7 through 19 of the VCU timeline. Now taking a look at these hilarious titles, let me know in the comments which of these projects were your favorite ones, or which one would you most be excited to see. For me, I'm gonna have to go with G-Man Days Past from the Future. That title is just hilarious. Now taking a look at this week's side plots, we have Hughie Sr. who's fully awake and claims he's never felt better after being labeled almost brain dead, as he considers it to be a miracle. As Hughie pulls his mom aside to confront her about giving his dad to V, which she gave his dad after it fell out of his pocket in last week's episode. She thought that Hughie was intending to give the V to his father, but did it on herself, as she is now confused by why she's being questioned by Hughie of what she did. She tells Hughie that she did it because he already grew up without one parent in his life and didn't want him to lose another one. We get to see Hughie enjoying some time with both of his parents for the first time since he was 6 years old, as they talk about their honeymoon and sharing some laughs and some old memories, and they also go as far as talking about traveling together again as a family. Now Hughie does ask his father why he gave the power of attorney to his mom, as he tells Hughie that he ultimately did that because he doesn't feel as though Hughie has the stomach to make tough decisions in life. A very important line to remember later in this episode, as we start to see the side effects from giving him the V is starting to take place as he starts to forget things. Now shortly after, Hughie Sr. goes missing, but they find him next to a dead body with that person's heart in his hand. As Hughie Sr. doesn't remember adult Hughie, as he panics and phases through the wall and runs into a patient and unphases in him, leaving a bloody mess. Now they find Hughie Sr. in the middle of the hallway and they try to get him under control, but it doesn't work. Again, he doesn't recognize adult Hughie, and when he sees Daphne, he gets upset because she left them and says,
"And you looked through me like I wasn't even there."
I thought his choice of words were very interesting because I always wondered how certain Supes' powers came to be, and it seems that when people take V later in life, their powers are based on their current personality or past experiences that affected them or hurt them. As Hughie Sr. said to Daphne that he felt unseen and saying to her that she looked through him, and now his Supes' power allowed him to phase through things like they're not even there. As we see Hughie telling his dad that he's his hero to stop him from killing his mom, and he does snap back to himself and it actually works. As we see Hughie does have to make that tough decision at the end of this episode, which will tie back to the Campbell family here in a bit. Meanwhile, we see in this week's episode that Starlight is completely broken. On TV, Annie watches Firecracker talking about how she's going to press charges against Annie from last week's beatdown. Now after Annie's meltdown, we see that her foundation is completely emptied and it has been destroyed, with people leaving some very upsetting words on the wall for her to see. Now throughout this episode, it's never really explained to why Annie's struggling to use her powers. To me, it was most likely because she's been confused on who she actually is, and with everything going on, she just doesn't know how to control herself. Now I would say that her confidence is severely damaged and causing her not to be able to tap into her abilities to use her powers, and like I mentioned in my review last week, I feel as though that we're going to probably see her struggle for another couple of episodes, and it'll probably take someone like Queen Maeve to return to help her get her confidence back. Now sticking with another character whose confidence is gone, let's talk about Frenchie, who really isn't doing that much in this entire episode. Now earlier in the episode, he finds a necklace in his desk that takes him back to a time when he was a religious person. Now he's mostly high in the episode and has a brief conversation with Annie about belief in God, and later we see him turn himself in. Again, I've said it before, but the show has no idea what to do with Frenchie at this point. Now we'll be discussing his decision a little bit later in the breakdown and what it could mean moving forward. Now in this episode, we see MM is still dealing with his family drama as we follow up with his daughter, who's now been suspended from school after continuing to act up and get into a fight with a Homelander supporter. Now MM's daughter claimed that she took action in fighting because of what her dad does for a living, as he is tasked to fixing the situation, which is his main motivation to surviving the farm massacre later in this episode, to get back home to his daughter to help her and to get her on the right path. Now we see Butcher meeting with Joe earlier in the episode, as Joe wants Butcher to ditch the boys, as he breaks down each member and how they're not fit to get the job done. Now, I've seen the speculation online, and I've seen it in my comment section regarding Joe being like a version of Becca for Butcher and not actually being there. And after this conversation and what happens a little bit later in this episode, I think is 100% true. For example, just looking at this exact scene, how else would Joe know those details about the members of the boys? Hell, even Joe sounded like Butcher when he was talking about the different members of the boys and also talking about how his tumor was getting worse. To me, just add more fuel to the idea that Becca is Butcher's good conscience, or in the metaphor of like a good angel, bad angel on his shoulder, Becca being the good side of him while Joe is being the bad side of him and representing the devil. Now, Butcher does rejoin the boys and he tells them that he doesn't have answers for how he mysteriously killed Ezekiel in last week's episode, but he does tell them that he does have the answers to all their prayers and shares with them that he has a virus that can kill the Supes. Now, like Butcher said to Victoria back in episode 1, he knows that the virus isn't strong enough to kill Homelander quite yet, which I don't know how he knows if it will work or not towards Homelander, but as I digress, he does plan to take it from Vic and wants to try it on her to kill her. But first, they need to get a familiar face out of prison. But switching gears and talking about what's going on at V52, we have A-Train and Sage talking about the leak, and it appears that she's very aware of his involvement, but right now she's playing very coy. Now let's have this conversation in the comments below, because like I said, I feel like Sage is 100% sure that she knows that A-Train is the leak, but she's not sharing it with Homelander and the other members. Now, do you think that she's keeping this information for her grander plan? Does she keep this information because of their past as teens together? Does she have a soft spot for A-Train? Let me know why you all think that she's not selling him out quite yet in this season. Now, the funniest and maybe the best part of this episode to me was cutting and seeing the various trailers of what's to come in the VCU, including a movie for Firecracker and A-Train. As we continue to see the show taking shots at companies like Disney, like I mentioned earlier, we see A-Train is on stage and talking to the audience about the most expensive TV show ever with the reshoots for the reshoots, as he says,
most expensive TV show ever. So, you know, it's gotta be good, am I right?
But maybe the best part and maybe the funniest moment of this episode for me is, and this being a perfect example of the boys poking fun of forced diversity within corporations, is them talking about the new diversity program headed by A-Train, Sage, and Black Noir. The idea behind the white audience seeing a tailor-made product placement versus the black audience was just so damn funny to me. Now, we see Firecracker isn't as dumb as she appears, at least in the eyes of Sage, as she confronts her about her plan last week of getting Starlight to beat her up, as she tells Sage,
Just think I'm stupid, poor white trash.
I don't think you're poor.
Underestimate me all you want. Makes that much easier to stick a fucking shiv in your back.
Now the question is, will this be a continued beef between these two characters? And what exactly does Firecracker have planned for Sage? Honestly, whatever they have planned for Firecracker and Sage, I hope it doesn't dumb down Sage, because again, if you are telling me that she's the smartest person in the world and her to be outsmarted by Firecracker would just completely diminish that idea. Now in the episode, we see that A-Train goes to Ashley because he needs her help to get Sage off his back, as he tells her that he was the actual leak. Now initially, Ashley doesn't want to have anything to do with helping him, but we see A-Train tells her, if you take me down, he's going to take her with her, as we see her plan come into motion by the end of this episode. Honestly, I can see Ashley playing along for now, because as we saw in this episode, Cameron ended up breaking up with her, so I think it kind of helped her out at this moment, but ultimately, I think Ashley's going to end up selling out A-Train. Now back on stage, the Guardians of Godolphin, Sam, and Kate are introduced to the audience. If you watch Gen V like I did, you'll remember in the finale that Kate lost her arm, but it seems like she has a new arm in this moment, and it also seems as though that Sam is still under his careless state of mind how he was left at the end of the finale of Gen V. Now I'm a fan of Kate and Sam and how they were used in season 1 of Gen V, but as it pertains to their inclusion and their cameo in this episode, I'll be honest, I was a bit disappointed because they didn't really feel like they needed to be there at all. But I get that this is them setting up season 2 of Gen V. Now we see Ryan making his return in this week's episode as we watch Adam pitches Ryan and Homelander his television series, but the newfound Homelander actually asks Ryan his opinion as he tells him that he doesn't want to do it. Now we watch Homelander force Adam to give Ryan his wallet and keys, as Homelander and Ryan have a bit of a heart-to-heart with one another as they're walking in the hallways, as he tells him that he doesn't have to follow the rules anymore, and he also says,
We are both emancipated from slavery.
Now, honestly, I'm not buying this newfound appreciation that Homelander has for Ryan and listening to his opinions. I think he's just kind of playing the long game, and right now just playing to be a good dad and listening to Ryan, but ultimately he's going to force him to do what he wants him to do. Now, backstage at V52, we see Ryan tells his dad that he wants to help people, he wants to actually be a hero and not doing all the fake stage saves as we saw a couple episodes ago. Now, Homelander hears him out and he actually sets him up on his first real hero moment in his eyes as Homelander calls over Adam and the young assistant that he's been bothering this entire episode. We see Ryan makes Adam apologize to her, but he doesn't like his tone and makes him do it again on his knees. Yet again, Ryan isn't pleased with this apology as he makes the assistant slap Adam over and over again, as we see that Ryan clearly is enjoying this. As far as enjoying this myself, I'll be honest, this whole he's a good kid, he's a bad kid isn't really working for me so far in this season. I like how the Ryan and Butcher relationship has been playing out so far, but I can't say the same about how it's been handled between Ryan and Homelander. Now, I get it. Ryan's a kid. He was sheltered for most of his life. He is easily influenced, and he's at that age where they're very, very, very impressionable. But the last time we saw him, I'm just speaking to the narrative of the story, he was upset about killing the stuntman and seamlessly got into a fight, his first fight with his dad, who was yelling at him for being with Butcher, and now all is forgiven and he's now leaning into the somewhat evil side of being Homelander's son? To me, Ryan is more of a MacGuffin this season than an actual character with actual motives and development. Let me know how you all felt about Ryan and how he was using this episode. Do you feel like me that it's kind of underwritten, or do you enjoy it? Let's talk about it in the comments below. Now, back with the boys, we see Butcher and MM pay Stan Edgar a visit in prison, as they tell him they want his help to get the V from Vic, and in return, he'll get his freedom from prison. Now, initially, Stan doesn't want to help the boys, but we see Butcher tells him what Vic did to her daughter and giving her the V, and if he'll help, he'll not only get his freedom, but they'll actually give him custody of her as well. We see that Stan eventually does agree to help the boys, and he joins the crew. Now, I'll be honest, this is a sight that I didn't think we'll ever see, and that is Stan working with the boys together. As they arrive to one of Stan's properties where Vic will go to keep her plans and secrets, they enter and they notice that there's blood stains on the wall, and it leads down to the basement where they find a testing laboratory for the virus being used on animals. As Butcher finds a rabbit who was getting shot up by Temp V, which reappears later in this episode, as the rest of the crew notices that the testing has seamlessly ended and something bad must have happened. And all of a sudden, all their noses start to bleed as we see that Vic is here and she got the alert from Stan's ankle monitor. Quick family reunion about betrayal is cut short when Vic questions what they've done with her lead scientist, Samir. Now, Stan has to convince her to not kill the boys, but instead let the boys help her in finding her missing scientist. Now, on this mission to find this missing scientist, they find some dead body with eggs in their stomach as they come across a beat-up chicken that flies through one of Vic's guard's stomachs, killing him. As they make their way out of the barn, we see that Vic and Butcher get into a disagreement as she spills the beans about him making a deal with her earlier in this season. Now, as they continue to look for Samir, we see that Butcher comes across that bunny that he let free out of that cage, who's ultimately dying, and as it's getting its final breath, we see these tentacles popping out of its stomach. Now, I think it's safe to assume that those tentacles can be found in Butcher and was probably what killed Ezekiel in last week's episode, and one would say that mixing the V and the Temp V does this to an individual. Meanwhile, the crew almost gets attacked by a V'd up bull who ends up getting eaten by some sheep that are flying. As they eventually find Samir, who we also learn is actually Zoe's dad, now he tells them that the virus is mostly gone except for one dose. As MM has to give the crew a pep talk and a reality check and convinces them to work together instead of for picking someone as bait, as they ultimately decide to inject the dead body with the last dose in hopes that the animals will eat them and get infected. As their plan ultimately works and we see the sheep are dying and falling out of the sky, meanwhile Samir is missing and thought to be dead as Butcher just pops out of nowhere. As we see, Stan ends up getting taken back to prison because he didn't get the deal done as MM says, but he's later broken out by Vic as it is assumed that they're now on the same page, or they'll probably most likely be using one another to get what they want. Now, we end this episode with Sage showing Tech Knight something that shocks him and she tells him to keep it under wraps. Now, that's never really explained what she showed him, but I think it's safe to assume that it has something to do with A-Train. Meanwhile, Homelander gives the team a speech about what it takes to be a hero. hero. As he says it's time for war, but first it's time to plug the leak as Deep brings in Cameron. Now this was of course being the favor that A-Train asked for from Ashley earlier in the episode, as like I mentioned, she was getting her revenge on being broken up with earlier in this episode as well, as they listen to Homelander's orders to show some wrath as they kill Cameron. Now, unfortunately, Kimiko had nothing to do in this episode except for talking about Frenchie, as we see her messaging him about being there for one another, but while she's doing that, we see that he's at the police station turning himself in, admitting to murder. Now, as harsh as this may sound, but I thought this was the best thing for Frenchie, which is I hope that he's in jail for the next several episodes, because his plot has been the worst of this entire season. Now, back with the Campbell family, we do see that Hughie does cook up a drug to put his dad down, as Daphne and Hughie say their goodbyes, and Hughie does actually follow through with making a tough decision, which is letting his dad go. Now, admittedly, losing his father didn't hit me as emotionally as I know the show intended to be, but I will say I thought that the performance by Simon Pegg was phenomenal. Like, he was the best character in this episode, seeing the emotional depths of him as an actor, playing to being the cheesy, corny dad that we know him to be in the show, but then going to those darker levels, and then the emotional goodbye to his son. Again, I wish I was more connected to their personal story, but again, I'm going to give kudos to Simon Pegg, who was phenomenal in this episode. Now, this might be a bit of a stretch, but I did feel like there was a parallel going on between what the boys were doing with having to put down those V'd up animals, and then kind of looking at how that parallels to Hughie having to put down his own dad. Now, the last scene of the episode shows Butcher taking Joe back to the farm, where we find out that Butcher actually made it look as though Samir was dead, only for him to cut off his leg, and he wants him to make them more of the virus. Now, to tie it back to the whole, is Joe there? Is he made up? Now, I think Joe actually was an actual person, but if you go back to when Joe and Butcher were talking in episode 1, and he talked about how Joe was saved by Butcher 11 years ago, I don't think he saved Joe. I think Joe actually died, but Butcher kind of kept that version of Joe attached to him and never really let him go, very similar to what happened with Becca. But like the scene at them in the park being somewhat an evidence of him not being there, I think this particular scene right here really submits that he isn't really there. Now, the biggest reason I say that Joe isn't here is this scene in particular, this moment when Samir looks over when Butcher says we and they, and he's talking to Joe, but when Samir looks over, the face that he gives almost gives the illusion that Butcher was talking to himself and wasn't actually talking to Joe. So again, I'm pretty confident that Joe is going to be revealed to be another Becca and be the evil side of Butcher. I could be wrong, but I think this episode really proves that Joe really isn't there.
I killed Ezekiel for you. I am inside of you. I am you. Which is why when I tell you you want to do this, I am literally telling you that you fucking want to do this. So don't you worry, Billy, my boy. That is home.
Well, it looks like my theory about Joe was true, which leads to Butcher being in the position of being the true villain of this season. Meanwhile, we get a small-scale version of Herogasm as Hughie finds out why they say you should never meet your heroes. As it is time for us to break down The Boys Season 4, Episode 6, spoilers ahead. We open this week's episode with Samir being awoken by Butcher and Joe, aka Butcher himself. More on that a little bit later, as Butcher takes this more reasonable approach to having him reset the virus process, versus Joe giving him a Walking Dead Glenn option by threatening to bash his head in. As Samir continues to refuse to help and even brings up Vic and his daughter for being his reasons why, as Butcher's symptoms return and he gives Samir a week to get this done. Now, before getting into the meat and potatoes of this week's episode, let's set the table first and talk about this week's side plots. As Daphne, Starlight, and Kimiko join Hughie, who at the request of his dad are dropping off his ashes on the sidewalk outside of the building where the film Made in Manhattan was made, while they're on this Made in Manhattan tour. Now, after just getting back in Hughie's life and Hughie just losing his father, we learn that Daphne is moving. I guess I was under the impression that she was going to play a bigger part in Hughie's life, especially after losing his dad and basically replacing the character in that role, but I guess I was wrong. Meanwhile, Kimiko is seen visiting, or at least trying to visit, Frenchie twice in this episode, but he refuses to see her. Not much more to offer on these plots, but if you've seen my previous breakdowns, the less that we get of these plots, the better for me, because they're extremely disappointing. But I will say, is the Kimiko and the Shining Light plot no longer a thing, or will that have a payoff by this season or next? And on on that note, I would say that it's safe to assume that the CIA will most likely bail Frenchie out in order to help them with whatever situation comes before or during the finale. Or they can simply just keep him in prison for all I care. Now, after Cameron's death, Vought News claims that he's taken a leave, as Firecracker is now his replacement and continues to share her ridiculous theories to the masses as she says,
"Are Jewish space lasers brainwashing you into joining their schools?"
Now, putting her craziness aside for a second, later in this breakdown, we'll discuss her master plan of getting Homelander on her side with the help of giving him his favorite drink. We see MM as trying new ways to calm his mind and lower his anxiety and lower his stress levels, but he can never find the right time to do so in this episode, as he gets a call from A-Train, who's in Toronto because he's fearful of his life after what happened to Cameron, as he knows it's just a matter of time before the 7, and more importantly, Sage calls him out. Now, MM tells A-Train to calm down. They'll figure this out together as he fills in the boys on Homelander's plan to build a soup army. The boys make the plan to infiltrate Tech Knight's Federalist Society party and gather intel on him, on which Sage shared with him in last week's episode. As the game plan is to have Hughie take on the secret identity of Webweaver, who is actually an alternative Spider-Man in the comics and comes from Earth 71409, and on his Earth he goes by the name of Cooper. Now, Cooper is a former classmate of Peter Parker who was bitten by a radioactive spider after pushing Peter Parker out of the way. Now, this particular character has actually been hinted at throughout this season so far, as he's made appearances on the news headlines on television. He was also a playable character in the Tournament of Heroes game, and also Butcher briefly mentioned him in last week's episode as he gave him money for giving them intel on Firecracker, but now we officially meet him. As we watch MM giving him the drugs for being a loyal CI, and he is tasked with helping him take it up his pooper. As we see MM taking another one for the team, and he gets the webbing straight from the source and on his mouth. Now we find out that MM actually switched his normal drugs with a more stronger drug, which is going to take him out for a few days as Hughie takes his costume. Man, you gotta feel bad for my boy MM, who's always having to literally do the dirty work for the boys, which it actually dawned on me in this moment that this is a tradition for MM to have something gross happen to him in previous seasons, and it's always in episode 6. Think about season 2, which was titled The Bloody Doors Off. Remember he got almost choked out by that soup's private part? Remember in season 3 with the famous episode Herogasm, and he was blasted with the sauce? Which makes me wonder, what will next season, episode 6, make him do? Hopefully it'll come full circle and he won't have to do the dirty work. Now, while all that was happening, we have Butcher who's talking to himself as Becca as she tells him that he's losing focus of saving Ryan. At this point, Butcher feels like he's mainly focused on just saving the world, or at least he thinks so, and he tells Becca, or aka himself, that he can't do both, save the world and save Ryan, as Becca says,
"You're gonna kill one Homelander, just end up with another."
Now we follow that conversation up with Joe sharing a story with Butcher about coming back home from war and him not feeling like he's in a normal world, and he knows that he was meant to make his enemies scream. As he says,
"Now tell me, Billy, who's the real you?"
Which is all setting up Butcher choosing between the good and the bad. But going back to that story, I am curious after what we find out at the end of this episode. I wonder if he's coming up with these stories based on his actual experience as Butcher, or was that an actual story from Joe that he told him years ago? With that out of the way, time to get into the main story of this episode, which takes us to Tech Knight's house and also his sex cave. Now this was a small detail, but you'll notice the icicle and the snow outside on the ground, which to me means that it's wintertime, which probably will set up a Christmas episode for next week's episode, and as far as the finale goes, we'll probably see the first official day that Singer's in office. Now inside, everyone cheers for Homelander as he's joined by Ryan and the more popular members of the 7 right now, which is Sage, A-Train, and Firecracker, which means they left Noir and Deep back at Vought, which we'll talk about here in a second. Meanwhile, we see Homelander gets to working the room as Knight comes up to him, kissing his ass, talking about a future team up between the two. And Homelander reminds him that they're not on the even playing field and that he needs his resources from now, but they're never going to be equals. Speaking of equals, we see Ashley walks in as Sage reminds her that she's the idiot child and not welcome, only to find out that her and Knight go way back and she got invited to go to a secret party, which is completely different from this one. Now within these conversations, we learn how Knight and his family got their money from being slave catchers and owning most of the private prisons in the US. As Knight makes his racist remarks towards A-Train about being able to catch him during slavery, you can also take his remark as him pointing out the fact that Sage might have told him that A-Train's the actual leak, as he says to A-Train that they would have caught him. Which, by the way, this scene here and meeting Knight's butler a little bit later makes what happens to him in this episode at the end feel so much better. Now out back, we see the boys boys poking fun of Hughie, who's wearing the web slinger's outfit, as we find out that he was exclusively invited by Knight himself, as Hughie is tasked with bugging his house and taking Knight as well. As Hughie makes his way in, he sees that the Seven is in attendance as well as Vic. We see Knight is extremely happy that Webb is in attendance, and we learn that his excitement comes from this being an interview process for Webb becoming his next sidekick, but first things have to go well as he takes him to see his tech cave. Now we see that this Tech Knight cave is basically a sex dungeon, as we learn that Knight's butler Elijah raised him since he was a kid after losing his parents. Now the show is definitely leaning into the idea that Tech Knight is compared to Batman in both Iron Man. He's rich, but he's also lost his parents, and he has a butler who's basically raising him as his own. But to further the conversations about him being compared to Batman, we meet his sidekick who's actually chained up in this sex dungeon. Now, while we never get to see the identity of Tech Knight's sidekick because he was in the mask this whole episode, in the comics, Tech Knight's sidekick went by the name of Ladio before becoming his own hero and went by the name of Swingwing. Now, I don't know if we'll see more of this character moving forward, especially after what happens at the end, but I would love to know who was under that mask. Meanwhile, Homelander and Sage fill Vic in about their planned sidebar with the 1%ers and sharing their plans with them to commit treason. As Vic also learns that Homelander is well aware of Stan Breakout and she plays coy about knowing. Right now it's hard to tell which side Vic is on, which to me easily makes her one of the most important and interesting characters of the show so far this season. And I really wish we would have swapped out all the Frenchie and Kimiko scenes and broke Stan out earlier this season and focused more on them and Vic's storyline, because like I said, I find her story and his story to be way more compelling than the others. Back up front, we see Noir is ready to quit his Black Ninja act, and we also find out he can fly in this episode, which I think will come up later this season, as Deep gives him a pep talk about why he should stay. Deep tells him about how him and old Noir were really good bros and how Noir got really excited whenever he killed someone. As this seemed to get to Noir and gave him some motivation that he needed to stay in character, which to me will most likely point towards a scene that was in the official trailer for this new season where Noir faces off against Butcher. And I will bet that that happens in the next episode. Back with the boys, Annie is afraid of what's happening to Hughie as he's not checking back in with them. They decide to go in and see if he needs saving. They take their weapons with them as well. We watch as Kimiko climbs up the wall and she lets Annie and MM in and they decide to split up. Now Kimiko dropping her phone can end up being nothing, or it's the show showing us that she just lost her main way of communicating with others because she would use her phone to type out her thoughts. But this can also be a plot to show us that she may have lost her phone and someone's going to find it, maybe like Sage or someone working within the Seven, and they're going to find important information on her phone and use it against the boys. So let me know in the comments, do you all think the phone's going to have some important information that will be used against the boys, or will it just end up being nothing? Now back at the party, after having abortion explained to her, we see Vic and Sage have a brief chat that seems to align them on the same team. As Sage shares with Vic a childhood story about how she wasn't listened to when it came to saving her grandmother from cancer after coming up with a cure. To me, this was Sage telling Vic that that was the reason in the moment of her life to make her live her life, not fully using her mind to save humans' lives around the world. As Sage invites Vic to join her after telling her this story and tells her. Now I could be wrong, but to me this scene kind of showed Sage as planning outside of Homelander's main plan. To me this is her making her own secret little team, and if things go bad, this is her grander plan to have the Deep, now Vic, and maybe A-Train join her to eventually take out Homelander. See Firecracker getting told to sit at the kids' table by Sage when she tries to get into the adult conversation, which was another example of Sage versus Firecracker beef that comes up a little bit later in this episode. Sticking with Firecracker, we see her running into Annie, who pretends to apologize to her, but ultimately knocks her out with one of the items from MM's soup weapons case. Just curious to know you guys' thoughts in the comments below. Before Annie knocked her out, do you think that Annie really meant what she was saying when she was apologizing, or was it all a ruse? We see MM and Kimiko find Sage while looking for Knight's secret entrance. Now Sage taunts MM by mentioning his daughter, who she's been keeping tabs on. He also talks about how his daughter has the same issues that he's going through with his anger and his ADHD, which pretty much sets MM back to square one after taking his meditation sessions, as he ultimately shoots her in the head. Now that action causes him to have a panic attack as he passes out. Now for those wondering how did Sage survive getting shot in the head, remember that one of her superpowers is that if her head, more importantly her brain, is damaged, it can just regenerate. We see Kimiko finds A-Train at the party and convinces him to take MM to the hospital, which he does. After dropping off MM at the hospital, we see a child smiling at him after seeing him be a hero, and we see A-Train smiles back at him. Yeah, that smile right there from A-Train is the death mark in my opinion. It is really safe to assume that he will make the switch to the boys by the season end, and we'll probably see him die as a hero, at least in the eyes of the show. Let's take a detour to see the freaky ass 69 guy Tech Knight choking himself while watching Webb sit on a cake, ass out, and making him fart on the cake as Ashley arrives and things are just getting started. See Ashley dressed up in all black and saying the most ridiculous Army Hammer things as she tickles Hughie's feet while whipping him. Now, while this might not be as explicit as Herogasm episode, this was pretty wild to see nonetheless. Now, Knight eventually figures out that it's Hughie under the mask and takes out his tools in preparation to torture him and create a new hole that he can fill. Now, before doing so, Annie and Kimiko save Hughie and they tie up Tech Knight. The torturing method doesn't work on Knight, but his sidekick helps them by giving them his computer. They start to donate to charities, but it's not until they mention Black Lives Matter and we see him reveal the plan that Sage told him in last week's episode. We learn that Homelander's plan is to use the prisons to hold those in who stand against him, aka
he's talking about internment camps.
Which is crazy because that's exactly what Joe, aka Butcher, said back in episode 1. As Elijah takes this opportunity to choke out Knight and says that he's going to make it seem like it was an accident as he's killing him, which is a huge payback for all of the years of damage, as he says,
Zendaya. The safe word was Zendaya.
Now it's time for Homelander's big speech to convince the bigwigs to join his mission, but unfortunately his mouthpiece isn't available as he sees that Sage won't be able to speak for him. Now Homelander tries to pull off a Thanos and do it himself, but he gives a very unconvincing speech, as Vic steps in and saves him by giving them the actual speech and convinces them to join. Now, I'll be honest, I get that this was Vic's big moment to the show to show us that she's taken the particular side and she's also taken the advice that was given to her by Sage earlier, but my issue is that it came at the expense of making Homelander look bad. By no means am I team Homelander, but I do admit he's the greatest villain on television right now, but from a narrative perspective, I really hated how the character was handled in this episode, starting with him not being able to use his powers to see or hear or notice that the boys were in the literal same building as him, then them embarrassing him like this, and then what happens with him later in the episode with the breast milk. To me, I just thought that episode 4 established that he wasn't going to be listening to humans anymore and making them do whatever he wants and not going back on his weaknesses. Like, why didn't he just laser one of those people in the room and just use them as an example for not listening to him? It's a mystery to me, but again, I just wasn't a fan of how the show made him look like he was 10 toes down on fully developing his darker version of himself, and in this episode taking him back to not doing that. I really hope I'm wrong and things will change next week or in the finale. Let me know how you all felt that Homelander was handled in this episode. Now, we end this episode with MM learning that he had a panic attack and that he's told that he's going to have to stop whatever he's doing to prevent something worse from happening, which to me is setting up the plot that he's going to be forced to leave the boys. Now, will that happen this season or next season, or will he die before that even happens? Now, Firecracker finally reveals her plan as she goes to Homelander and tells him about Annie being at the party and ties that to the boys being a part of Knight's death, as he realizes that the leak is still present and it wasn't Cameron. Now, Firecracker takes his opportunity to also put a lot of this on stage and tell Homelander that she's not really doing her job. She also says how loyal she is to him after he saved her and made her someone important, as she tells him that she's been taking pills to help her lactate as she shares her milk with him, making her the new Madeline. Which, by the way, Homelander's obsession with breast milk isn't public knowledge, which makes me wonder, how does she know that? Then makes me wonder, does she have some inside information from someone that actually might be a secret mole? As our last scene reveals something that I mentioned in my last video what happened, as the true identity of Joe is revealed. As Samir tells the truth about the virus and why he will not continue to recreate it, because in order to make it strong enough to kill Homelander, it will be unstable and become airborne and highly contagious and practically kill all the Supes, including Ryan. Now, Butcher is left with his decision to force Samir to continue as Becca tries to talk him out of that option until Joe tells her to shut up, revealing that he's been Butcher this whole time. As we learn that Joe died years ago and Butcher never saved him, which is something I mentioned in my last breakdown, as Joe basically was the tumor that killed Ezekiel in last week's episode, as we see Joe tells Butcher,
"That is home."
Now, I don't know if Butcher's going to go down the path of trying to take Vic or even Zoe and holding them hostage to make Samir do what he wants him to. Maybe that's how Frenchie gets back into the story. Like, we're going to see Butcher breaking him out of jail. Or maybe we're going to see Butcher convincing the CIA or the president to go down this route to getting the best scientists to recreate the virus, leaving the boys trying to stop Butcher from doing so, and Joe coming out, and we're going to see Joe/Butcher going against the boys.
God, I'm going to enjoy this so much. First, you try to cancel me, victimize an innocent man, because I guess that's just cool to do to white guys nowadays. But joke's on you. Me Too's over, sweetheart. It didn't work. Wah, wah, wah. I do not respect your truth. I do not honor and cherish your story. I do not f***ing apologize.
It's Christmas time for the boys and everyone gets a special gift. We've got 2 Annies, a pissed off Homelander, newly discovered Eskimo brothers, and a working virus that leaves Kimiko temporarily missing a part of her leg. As it is time to break down this penultimate episode of season 4 of The Boys, spoilers ahead. We open this week's episode with a rehearsal for the upcoming Vought Christmas special starring members of the Seven and Ryan. As A-Train teaches Ryan about Atifa in the world of The Boys,
see something, say something, cause he hates America and Christmas too.
Now after getting a little sing-along by A-Train, we see Ryan cutting rehearsal short because of the lyrics of the song. As he learns that the lyrics were actually approved by his dad, we see Ryan puts on a fake smile and laughs it off and walks away, which to me was setting up the stage for Ryan to speak up against this message a little bit later in this episode. Now speaking of setting the stage, we see Sage unexpectedly sees a meeting taking place earlier than planned because Firecracker moved it up as she sits right next to Homelander. After Homelander kicks out Ashley from this meeting, he gets straight to the point and wants to know who the leak is as he cracks the glass table with one of the boys' hidden microphones found at Tech Knight's house. At this point, Homelander seems to have had enough with the boys and wants to eliminate them, but Sage is confident that the boys will not be leaking the information they gathered, but more importantly, it's all going according to her plan. As she also reminds Homelander that Butcher's pending doom is right around the corner and that killing off CIA assets wouldn't be a good idea at this moment. Now, even though Sage says that this is all going according to her plan, we see Homelander reminds her that
you have brains, Sage, but I have wisdom.
As Homelander tells her that him and Firecracker will be taking care of this leak. Meanwhile, she just has to take care of setting up the shooter who's going to be responsible for the coming up assassination that they have planned, as we see A-Train is outside listening to this entire conversation. Now, taking a moment to talk about the side plots that we got in this week's episode, we cut over to Deep and Ambrosius having some alone time, which is unfortunately cut short after Sage texts him about meeting up a little bit later to get her mind off of the recent meeting. As the Deep continues to dismiss Ambrosius' request to put her in the tank above his bed, this is setting the stage for the biggest fight between this couple that we've seen in the show so far. We see Annie calling her mother Donna, who makes her first appearance this season after last being seen in episode 3 of season 3 when Annie had her flashbacks when she was a little kid doing those pageants. Now Annie is trying to convince her mother to relocate because of the fear of what's to come with everything going on with the election and Homelander. She just wants to make sure her terrible mother is safe. Now within this scene, we also get a brief glimpse of where Hughie has been keeping all of the dirt on Newman, which will be important a little bit later. Meanwhile, we have Donna continuing to kind of preach at her daughter about being kicked out of her Tuesday Bible study group and shares her 2 cents about everything going on with Annie in the news. As Donna wants Annie to reclaim what she wanted Starlight to actually be, as Annie learns from her mom that Hughie kept her outfit after she threw it away. This scene to me just continues to show all the pressure and all the decision weighing on Annie as we see Hughie's trying to encourage her to take the extra step to make sure that everything's going to work out. But I think this actually sets up this whole identity crisis that we know is going on with Annie, which plays a bigger part into her identity being taken a little bit later in this episode. As A-Train passes along the intel he gathered on the hired gun to the boys, we see that they're going to plan to visit him a little bit later as Butcher walks in. Now against Joe's advice, we see Butcher telling the boys that he did take Samir and that he has him recreating the virus, and oh yeah, he also chopped off his leg. Now Butcher also shares with them the current state of the virus, which would kill all the soups, which we know Butcher's good side doesn't want that to happen, as he tells them that he worked out a special deal with the CIA, which is something I theorized in my last video, as we see Frenchie is now out of jail against his own will to help them contribute to making the virus only strong enough to kill Homelander and no one else. As MM tells the boys that he won't be going with them on this mission and he puts Butcher back in charge because of his recent health scare. Now sticking with MM, we see him preparing a plan to protect his family by giving his ex a flight plan and some money to live on as he instructs her to take their daughter and to move as far away as possible because of what's about to happen soon. As we watch them kiss, we see that she wants them to be a family again and she wants them to go with them, which is something we see him struggling with in this episode. Meanwhile, Ashley mourns Cameron's death and recently fires her best assistant she's ever had, and she's also getting drunk in the morning. Now Ashley's guilt is definitely getting the best of her as she tells A-Train,
"It's so easy to become a monster around here."
As Ashley comes up with the idea of them leaving together to Florence, but we see A-Train telling her to get her stuff together, and this conversation comes into play a little bit later. But as I mentioned a few videos ago, that it was going to be interesting to see how they're going to play out this relationship, and I don't think it's going to be resolved in the finale next week, but it is something I'm looking forward to seeing in season 5. Now back at Homelander's penthouse, we see Ryan looks under the Christmas tree to find a gift from Butcher. Now the gift is a picture of Butcher and his mom Rebecca and their dog, showing Ryan what a happy family they were once upon a time, and just giving the Ryan again the kind of planting the seeds of showing him what happiness could look like further away from his father Homelander. So now that we got all the side plots set up, let's talk about the main plots of this episode, which is the boys' mission to find the shooter and Homelander and Firecracker taking out the leak. As the boys arrive to the shooter's apartment, we see Butcher heads out back to find Joe trying to figure out when he became so soft towards the soups. As Butcher's putting the silent treatment on Joe, but it doesn't stop Joe from calling out Butcher for his past mistakes, one that involves him cheating on Becca. Now speaking of Becca, you'll notice that we haven't seen her since Joe's reveal, which to me kind of points out the fact that Butcher's bad side and that tumor is getting closer to fully taking over his mind with vengeance and anger towards completely destroying any and all soups and not just Homelander. Now inside the shooter's apartment, they find the details of the assassination, but here's something in the back room. As they find a woman beaten and claims that she's been held hostage for a few days, she notices that Annie is Starlight and says something that I believe will be important to identify this person later on, as she says to Annie,
"Okay? It's like a furnace in there."
As they continue to help this woman out, she kicks into fight mode and pushes Annie and cuts Hughie's hand and runs away. As they chase this person down the hallway, we see them touching a residence as their skin begins peeling off, and eventually they tear off their own skin of the previous face that they had as they reveal themselves as the woman they just touched, showing that this is a soup with the abilities to shapeshift into anyone they touch. Which I gotta admit, I think this is the smartest plan that Sage has come up with, because this is the perfect choice for assassination, but also the perfect soup to make the boys turn out to be the ones to blame with this coming up assassination plan. Now we've seen a shapeshifter in the boys previously who went on the name of the Doppelganger, who Homelander killed back in season 2. Now if my memory serves me right, the Doppelganger only had the ability to change into people and it wasn't as gruesome as this new one. I guess my next question is, has this new shapeshifter soup taken any other character in this season before? And what I'm basically getting at is, it wouldn't be surprising if it's revealed that Daphne, Hughie's mom, might have been the shapeshifter in the past. To me, that would be a very interesting reveal in the finale if it is indeed Daphne that was a shapeshifter, or any other characters within the season. And also, what other abilities does this shapeshifter have? We'll be discussing that a little bit later in the breakdown. Now as Hughie suggested the boys split up, we see him lying, saying he's going to take care of his hand, but he actually pays a visit to Vic, hoping that he can convince her to change her mind with working with Homelander. Now Hughie brought over her favorite snacks, which was a sign of good faith. We see him immediately gets into the bad side of her working with Homelander because he's the worst person in the world, but she doesn't even blink an eye. Now Hughie takes it up another level and even questions her being okay with the idea of the plans being behind the prison camps, which she wasn't even aware of. Unfortunately, none of these tactics have worked, as we see Hughie having to remind her that he still has the dirt on her, but he doesn't want to use it in hopes that she'll make the right decision. But as of right now, she's sticking by her plan and she's going to be working with Homelander. Now before leaving, we see that Vic does tell Hughie that she's sorry for what just happened to his father, which to me just shows a little bit of a moment that shows that she still might have a chance of doing the right thing against Homelander in next week's finale. Now after not finding MM on the most recent mission with the boys, we see A-Train pays him a visit and he finds him packing his bags as he is prepared to leave with his family. A-Train shares his experience of saving MM's life and how seeing that kid smile at him,
that felt better than anything that I had ever done at Vought. For once, I didn't hate myself.
But MM kind of pushes back and tells A-Train about this never-ending fight he's seen throughout his life and how it's killing him from the inside, and he doesn't even know who he is when he looks in the mirror, except that he knows that he has a family that he loves and he wants to protect them by any means necessary. But A-Train reminds him that he can't go any place in the world without Vought or Homelander finding him, and that moment right there to me is the moment that I believe MM heard that to make the decision that he's going to make at the end of this episode. Now I gotta admit, as far as the acting goes, this was the best acted scene in this episode to me, because I find it very interesting the parallel that we have going on with literally A-Train, a person that can literally run away from his problems and run away from anything, and having him and MM having this narrative to me is a really nice touch. And like I said, the acting in this scene was pretty top notch if you ask me. Meanwhile, Kimiko and Frenchie are with Samir as Frenchie is playing the good guy by feeding him and ensuring him that they'll make the virus with the beat up equipment they have, because that's what he does. He makes a lot out of a little. Now, Frenchie also assures him that the virus will only be used to kill Homelander and not Vic. While he's working on this new virus with Frenchie's new suggestions, we see Frenchie and Kimiko talk about his guilt and him turning himself in. As we see Kimiko sharing her story and we learn the origins of why she doesn't speak. As we flash back to a scene where we see young Kimiko as a little girl on her first night in the camp. We see Shining Light telling these young kids they have to become ghosts and they have to be silent at all times. As we watch a young Kimiko fight another little girl, and the plan is whoever makes a noise loses, as we see Kimiko takes the first cut and she doesn't make a sound as she ends up murdering the other little girl and has no hesitation in doing so. She ended up setting Kimiko on this path of complete silence, and when it came to her finally getting a chance to talk, she couldn't do it. So the biggest takeaway I took from that flashback was basically it's saying that her inability to speak is attached to that moment, and her not speaking is almost like a mental block. It's like her way of not moving past that moment, and also her blaming herself for not making the choice to go against those people who have given the orders of killing her at that time. As we see them talking about hating looking at themselves in the mirror, as Frenchie comes up with the idea to make the right choice by letting Samir go once he completes the virus. Now, I've mentioned in previous breakdowns, and I'm a fan of Kimiko and Frenchie, but honestly, the Shining Light plot this season and Frenchie's plot with Colin and their guilt, I get what they're doing. The whole theme of the season is your past catching up to you, but I just have a feeling that when it comes to the finale next week, we're not going to get a satisfying arc for both of these characters. They're going to probably carry this over to season 5, which makes me look back at all the times with Colin and Frenchie, Kimiko and this mysterious girl, and them just constantly being down and out about what they did. And again, I get the point of the storyline, but it just feels like a giant waste of time. So let me know what you all thought about this reveal of why Kimiko can't speak. And do you all think that we'll get a satisfying conclusion this season, or will it wrap up in season 5? Now, we watch Homelander leaving Ryan a message about the Christmas special, and he wants him to suck it up and just do it, as him and Firecracker have found the leak, and it's the one and only web weaver. As he is just spraying his webs all over this room, as he tells Homelander how he would tell Butcher what he wants to know. Now, we see Homelander wants to get more details about how Web Weaver would tell Butcher about certain things like the meeting between him and Vic earlier in the season, but he's had enough of him webbing all over the place as we see him choke him and he starts to rip him apart as he thanks Firecracker for finding what he believed to be the leak. Now, back with the Deep, we see Ambrosius confronts him about Sage as they go back and forth in this very on-the-nose argument that felt like an episode straight out of a CW drama, as the Deep, or as she calls him by his real name Kevin, loses control and smashes her tank, killing possibly the one thing that actually loved him. Now, I see the Deep killing Ambrosius very similar to what we saw Homelander do when he went down to kill all those scientists, this being the moment or the last thing from him just losing himself and going completely over the edge. Now, I've always looked at the Deep as a character that you can't take seriously. Like, obviously there's the Aquaman jokes and the over-the-top extreme broness of the character, but if we're being honest, his arc this season, and he really hasn't had many arcs in previous seasons besides maybe season 2, do you all care about the Deep? I'm just curious to know in the comments below, do you all care about whenever we switch over to the Deep? Do you feel like I do at this point, that it's kind of redundant, it's kind of pointless, or do you actually enjoy spending time with the Deeps, and do you think that this particular side plot with the Deep plays into the overall narrative of the story? Let's talk about it in the comments below. Now, after killing his one true love, we see the Deep does go to Homelander, who gives him the orders to finally take out the boys. Cut to Annie and Butcher back at the boys' flat, where the Deep and Black Noir are waiting for them. Now, the Deep lets them know that they are here to kill them, and we get the best moment to me in this episode as far as the action goes, and probably one of the best action scenes of this season, as we see Annie and Butcher versus Black Noir and the Deep. As we watch the Deep versus Annie, and Butcher tries his best against Black Noir. Now, granted, we know Butcher did manage to escape the original Black Noir back in season 2, but if this was the OG Black Noir, and knowing how sick Butcher is, this fight would not have been fair. But we know that this new Noir isn't trained in combat. He's a paid actor suit with strength and he can fly, but he also suffers from falling asleep every now and then, which he does in this scene. Now, as the fight goes on, we see both Annie and Butcher are losing, as Butcher calls out for Joe like he did with Ezekiel, but he doesn't appear because the silent game goes two ways, as Joe says later in this episode. But who does appear is A-Train, as he saves Annie in the process, while MM arrives using a Gatling gun to temporarily take out Black Noir. Now, Deep and A-Train have their one-on-one fight, and we see A-Train shares how he actually feels about the Deep. Meanwhile, we see Annie gets the final touches by knocking him out. Now, Butcher tells the rest of the boys that they should just take advantage of this and actually kill Deep while he's down, but MM reminds him that they don't know how to go about killing the Deep as they decide to leave before Black Noir returns. Look, I get where MM is coming from, but they don't know that Black Noir isn't the Noir they think it is, so if I was them, I would have just killed the Deep right then and there. Like, I just would have smashed his head in with that weight, but hey, that's just me. Now, after revealing himself as a leak, we see A-Train takes up Ashley's offer from earlier as he goes to her office wanting them to leave together. Now, just as they're about to leave, we see that Ashley ultimately decides to stay back, but she does tell him to remove his chip, that way that Vought and Homelander won't be able to find him. Now, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I feel pretty confident that this might be the last time we see A-Train this season, but he might end up coming up in the finale and might end up dying like we all kind of theorized in the last few weeks. But I would actually like to see A-Train continue redeeming arc, and maybe we see him go to Florence, maybe with Ashley in the future, or maybe he's gonna go where MM's family is and kind of keep them safe, and maybe that ties into season 5. He's gonna see MM's family be taken and he's going to be a hero again, and that's going to get him killed. Besides A-Train in this moment, let me know in the comments, why is Ashley staying back? Do you all think that she's just so afraid to run away from Vought and Homelander, knowing that they're going to probably find her? Or do you think Ashley has her own alternative motives, that she might want to stay to actually take down Vought, spill the beans of the situation that they've been doing, cover-ups, Homelander cover-ups? Let me know again what you think about A-Train. Will he be back in the finale, or will he be in season 5? And why did Ashley stay behind? Now, we end this episode with MM, Butcher, and Annie at a bar where we see a random fan gets a picture of Annie, and she also gets something else as well. Now, we see MM steps aside to call his ex and let her know that he will not be joining his family on his flight, that he's going to be staying behind, and maybe, just maybe, one day he's going to rejoin them and they're going to be a family again. Again, MM's performance, Marvin was just great in this episode, and I really do hope that he gets his happy ending, whether it's in next week's finale or in the series finale of the show. Meanwhile, Annie questions Butcher about him bringing up the name Kessler back at the flat, as we see Butcher pretending that he doesn't know what she's talking about. As we see Homelander is heartbroken about A-Train's betrayal, which personally I think, yes, he might be slightly upset that it's A-Train because of how long they've probably been working together, but I think he's more upset about the idea of yet another member of the Seven betraying him, as we see Sage questions why he didn't listen to her about not trying to kill the boys from earlier. Now, Sage does reveal that she knew that A-Train was a leak, as she tells him that this was all going her plan until now.
But A-Train only leaked exactly the information I wanted Butcher and his team to know. He was the perfect disinformation delivery system.
As this clearly pisses off Homelander as he ends their agreement, and we see Sage leaves, and she leaves her notebook behind. But before leaving and walking out, she also tells him,
"Surround yourself with people like her, and you can systematically eliminate anyone who gets in your way, but there's one person you will never, ever defeat."
What exactly did Sage mean at that point? Was she referring to Homelander's need to have people surrounding him that's always going to say yes, whether that's men or women? Or was she referring to him not defeating Father Time or defeating himself? Like, let me know who you all think that she was referring to about not being able to defeat that one thing. Meanwhile, we have Deep and Noir broing over what just happened as their relationship and their bromance grows closer, as Sage leaves and tells them that she just got fired, as we see the new Noir confesses his love towards her to Deep's surprise. They both find out that she's been sleeping with both of them and using them, but Noir didn't have to lobotomize her like the Deep did, which in my eyes, like I said, makes their bromance even closer, as they're now Eskimo brothers. Now, a question I have for you all, was her sleeping with both of them a part of some grander plan that we don't know quite about yet, or was it just her satisfying her sexual desires? And did she not have to get done with Noir because he's smarter than Deep, or do you think she got like a 2-for-1 deal, like she would have Deep lobotomize her and then she would go to Noir after? Now, back with Frenchie and Kimiko, they find out that the virus is now working, and as they're about to let the doctor go, I'm under the impression that he was thinking that they were going to probably kill him once they got the virus working. So with that being said, he takes the virus and stabs Kimiko in the leg, and he ultimately escapes. Now, in a panic of what to do, we see Frenchie thinks quick on his feet and pulls another Walking Dead reference and chops off her leg to prevent the virus from spreading, and he ends up saving Kimiko's life. I'll be honest, I had to suspend my disbelief because we know that Samir is not a soup and he's also missing a whole half of his leg, so I don't know how he was able to get away so fast, but I am very curious to know if he will be playing a part in next week's finale. As we see, the boys are now together again as they find out that the virus is now working, and even though it's not quite strong enough to take out Homelander quite yet, it might be just quite possibly strong enough to take out Vic. As who we believe to be his Annie at the moment says that this is all we have is a maybe, we see MM gives the boys a pep talk. As Ryan listens to the voicemail from his dad from earlier and takes that as the final straw to speak the truth, as we see the Muppets do their sing-along, but Ryan stops them on live television as both Homelander and Butcher watch as he says,
My mom always told me to tell the truth. Which is why I'm sorry.
Now, Butcher couldn't be happier what Ryan just did as he looks over at Joe and tells him that is the reason why he still has faith in Ryan, but unfortunately his illness is probably at the worst point that he's experienced so far as we watch him pass out. And you'll notice a smile that Joe has on his face before he passes out, which to me kind of indicates that I think Joe's going to probably fully take over Butcher by next week. Back with Hughie and Annie, for the first time this season, they actually show some affection towards each other as we see Annie puts on her Starlight uniform and they have sex. As who we believe to be Annie putting the Haktua on Hughie, who's sound asleep, she goes into his safe to get all the dirt on Vic as it is revealed to be the shape-shifting soup from earlier as we cut over to Annie, who's somewhere chained up as she realizes the switch happened back at the bar with the women who took the picture with her.
America will be safe again. I'm coming for you.
The United States of Homelander has officially begun. A lot went down in the last 30 minutes of this episode, and we're about to go in like shapeshifters 2 fingers into Hughie's butt. Okay, a little bit too far, as it is time to break down the final episode of season 4 of The Boys. Spoilers ahead. We open this finale with VNN Today breaking the news that after A-Train's betrayal, his long-awaited film has been canceled. Now, even though it's been completely finished, as we get this Batgirl reference,
though it's completely finished, we just realized we'd make more from the write-off.
Followed by the new VOT PSA, All Lives Matter. As everyone is awaiting this historical date of January 6th, as voting for the president has its complications after singer Soup Agenda has made things difficult. Speaking of difficult, we see the pressures on Frenchie to get the virus out before Newman is one head pop away from becoming president. Now, before it all hits the fan, let's break down the finale side plots, as we'll start with Hughie, who's also feeling the pressure from MM to ID the shapeshifter, which, speaking of, we see that they're distracting Hughie by proposing to him, which forces him to give them the ring that his mother gave him a couple episodes ago as we watch them propose to one another. Now, after celebration sex, we see the shapeshifters in need of a recharge as their skin's starting to peel off as they make up some excuse to leave. Now, you'll notice that Hughie is starting to get a sense that something may be off about his future wife. Now, after his latest fall, we find Butcher in a hospital bed. As it's only a matter of time before he kicks the bucket, we see Joe offering to help him and giving him a new fresh start with his new super cancer tumors, as all Butcher has to do is just hand the keys over to him and let Joe fully take control. As we see the plan between Butcher and Mallory starting to take place as she arrives because they got some work to do. As Homelander finds the picture that Butcher gave Ryan, we see him snap. Ryan walks in to see the aftermath after his father was pissed off with what he found. We see Homelander instructing Ryan to come to him. As we see, Ryan is clearly a little bit afraid, but he's not afraid enough to leave the situation as he ultimately does leave the room. And I gotta be honest with you all, the tease this whole season between them has become very frustrating, but we'll talk about them a little bit more in depth a little bit later in this breakdown. Now, switching gears and talking about the conversation between Shapeshifter and Annie, we see that the Shapeshifter gets their recharge, as it does confirm my theory that not only can they take a person's identity, but they can also take their memories and most likely the soup's powers as well. As they tell Annie they won't be killing her mom, and they share with them the news of the recent engagement. As we watch the shapeshifter basking in their glory, they share with them the first time that they actually shifted and tells Annie how everyone they've ever turned into always thinks,
think you're the heroes of your own story. I mean, look at you. You're more moral and good and honest.
As Annie pushes back, but the shapeshifter reminds her of her recent lack of confidence is the reason behind her not being able to use her powers. As the shapeshifter may have explained why Annie was the one chosen to take their form, because as they put it, she was the one that was supposed to take out Vic, so that kind of explains why they chose Annie, as she's going to be now blamed for the assassination. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I haven't been the biggest fan of Annie's subplot this season because it kind of feels recycled from previous seasons, but I gotta say, this version of her being a villain kind of fits pretty perfectly. Like, she naturally fits into this role, and I thought Erin was phenomenal in this episode. As we watch Hughie giving Butcher a call to check in on him, we see Butcher shares with him this very personal story about him and his brother Lenny. As Hughie wants Butcher to fight, but Butcher wants him to do him one last favor as he tells him,
"Tell the boys I'm sorry."
Man, was someone cutting up some onions in this scene? Like, as I'll talk about later, the Butcher last moments trying to fight for the good and evil has been one of the more better plots this season for me personally. As we cut to Homelander and Firecracker getting ready to go live on Vought News with Vic, we see Firecracker pressing Vic about Singer's new soups laws as Homelander tunes out and drops a real truth bomb. As he interrupts Vic and forces her to tell the truth, Vic plays coy at first, which makes Homelander call her out as a soup on live television as she immediately denies the allegations, but the cherry on top is when he lasers her to prove his point. Now, I could be reading this wrong, but Vic turning her eyes on, was that because she was trying to shield herself from the blast of Homelander, or was she trying to pop his head, but she realizes that it was impossible to work on him? As Vic confronts Homelander, she tells him,
I worked my whole life to keep that secret.
Well, secrets rot your soul. If you're unburdened, you should thank me.
Vic points out the holes in Homelander's master plan, but as he puts it, new world, new rules. As Homelander tells her to suck it up and get on board, as he walks away, she tells him,
You'll have to arrest half your company, half the country.
You think I didn't think of that? Of course I thought of that.
Which actually sets his next plan in motion, which is to have Ashley gather everyone in Vought's payroll who's ever had anything against him or the Seven. Now, despite the recent outing of Newman, we see that Newman and Singer election gets certified as we see the tensions at an all-time high. Now, the virus still isn't ready yet, so we see telling Hughie to get the dirt on Newman as we see Hughie finds out that all that dirt's been taken away, as pulls a Hail Mary and he takes Kimiko with him, and it's time to play some defense. As we watch a new president speaks,
Victoria Newman becomes vice president. It will be over my dead body.
As Mallory and Butcher watch this announcement, their plan is starting to take place as Ryan finally arrives. Butcher tells Ryan that he has to leave with Mallory and promises that Homelander won't find him. Now, Ryan admits that he likes parts of staying with Vought as Mallory is about to tell him the truth about her father, but Butcher stops her and reminds Ryan the last request that his mother made to him, which was keeping Ryan safe. It seems like the reverse psychology is working so far as Ryan wants to stay and play a game and connect forward with Billy. Now, back with the Seven, we see Ashley has the list that Homelander requested. As Homelander tells the Seven about the assassination and what's to follow after, which is going to be a bunch of chaos which they know is coming, as his plan is to have every soup on Vought's payroll to defend Vic. Now that Homelander has that list and he gives it all to the Seven, he wants them to take care of killing everyone on the list that Ashley gave them, which, speaking of Ashley, we see the Deep brings up that shouldn't she be number one on the list, as we see Homelander agrees and Ashley hears this outside. Now, in a panic, we watch Ashley runs into Homelander's penthouse and takes Compound V, and she becomes a soup to protect herself from the Seven. As we watch her transformation after taking the V, we see that her brain begins to grow. Now, based on my theory I shared with you all weeks ago when we saw Hughie Sr. taking the Compound V and we saw that his power stemmed from his emotions at that moment, it makes me wonder what powers will Ashley have now. Like, we know that she's been smart enough to make it this far to survive the Seven, so will the next time we see her, will she look something like this? Let me know in the comments what you all think about Ashley taking the Compound V and where she's headed next. Is she going to meet up with A-Train? Is she going to go back to Florence? Let me know what you all hope to see in Ashley in the final season, but more importantly, what power will she have next time we see her? Now that the stage is set, let's break down the second half of this finale, which was way better than the first in my personal opinion. Now, underneath the Pentagon, we see taking charge as the team is prepped to protect the president, but little do they know, the shapeshifter is right there with him. Now, not to toot my own horn, but like I said in my last breakdown, the line from the shapeshifter about being hot comes full circle as they say they're hot in this moment, and this is where Hughie remembers that exact line as he realizes that this isn't Annie. Now, speaking of the real Annie, meanwhile, we see that Annie manages to escape by ripping off her chains. Now, Hughie tells about Shapeshifter's presence, and again, I'm loving the performance by Erin, who is able to read the room and realizes that they've been made. As we finally get some action 30 minutes into this finale, we see the shapeshifter takes out both Hughie and leaving them to go against Kimiko. Now I gotta highlight some of these kills before we get to the fight between them and Kimiko. The kill when we saw the shapeshifter throwing the guard into that railing or that safe and breaking their back. From there we go to them clubbing the guard to death, RIP to Joel, and then they toss another guard's head into a coat hanger. Now after taking out the last guard by biting their neck open, we get Kimiko versus the shapeshifter. Kimiko manages to hold them down for Hughie and MM to protect the president, but we see Kimiko ends up getting their neck snapped. As Hughie and MM are the only ones left to protect the president, we have Annie, the real Annie, magically literally coming out of nowhere. Now to be fair, she does explain how she found him a little bit later in the episode, but is it just me or did she get there with A-train levels of speed? And also, how did she manage to get past all those guards of probably the most secure building in the world? But I guess I'll just let it slide. Now we get to see this fight between Annie and the shapeshifter, and honestly it was extremely disappointing because it was so quick, it wasn't exciting at all. Now I'm thinking she's about to bash her face in, she's gonna get her powers back, blow up her head, but Annie just chokes her out and kills her in such a lackluster way. Now from a character's perspective, I've talked about it before, that this was gonna happen, that this was gonna be the moment where Annie physically and metaphorically has to kill some type of version of herself to get her confidence and her powers back, which we see later in the episode. Now on a positive note, while I thought the execution was clunky as hell, I did enjoy seeing the evil version of Annie within this episode. Now we see Vic calling Homelander and asks to speak to Sage, which triggers Homelander and he tells her,
"If you stray even an inch off that path, I will make sure Zoe knows nothing but pain for the rest of her life, and I will send you a piece of her every year for the rest of yours. There is no fail."
Now this being the moment that Vicky realizes this is her last straw with Homelander, as she just has to get out to protect herself and her daughter Zoe. Which, by the way, I don't want to forget to bring this up, where the hell was Stan during this whole finale? Like, was he hiding somewhere? I would assume he's going to play a big part into season 5, especially after what happens to his granddaughter and also his kind of pseudo daughter in Vic. But let me know if you all were slightly disappointed to not see Stan in this finale. Now back with the boys, we see Annie gets patched up and she has the big talk with Hughie. Clearly she's upset, which to me is kind of crazy. Like, literally this was someone that looked identical to you, but I get it. She is upset about Hughie not only having the engagement to this shapeshifter, but she also learned that they slept together. But Hughie tells her that he ultimately realized it wasn't Annie by all the little things he tells her, but she's still kind of upset at the moment as we see Hughie gets a call from Vic. Now as the last scene highlighted, she doesn't want to work with Homelander anymore, as her and Hughie have a little bit of a back and forth in the conversation over the phone, as we actually learn this conversation that she was very much aware of their plan of killing her, which confirms that the one-legged Samir was okay. Now we see how much Vic trusts Hughie as she wants him to get Zoe, and we see that she tells him that he's the only person that she trusts in the entire world. I'll speak to this a little bit more in depth when we get to the character breakdown in this video, but the moment that Vic has right now was bound to happen, but to me it just felt so rushed in its conclusion and it was just poorly executed. Again, we'll talk about it more in depth, but let me know if you all were surprised by this moment of Vic going to Hughie, or like me, did you all just see this a mile away? As we watch Hughie discussing letting Vic in, we see that he speaks his mind to the rest of the boys. Now y'all know how I feel about Hughie, but I gotta say, that was one pretty damn good line that he delivered to the boys.
If we're ever gonna win against monsters, I think we need to start acting human.
As they do agree to bring Vic in, we see MM brings up that it did work out with A-Train and the same could probably happen with Vic, but if things go south, they do have a plan to take her out. Now this whole scene here is all about forgiveness, as we see Annie basically forgiving Hughie and wants him to take a test, meaning that they're going to still be together. We also see Frenchie and Kimiko talking about the plan to let Vic in and how this plays into their redemption plan of forgiveness as well. And oh yeah, speaking of Frenchie and Kimiko, their whole love plot is back on as we see them kiss, which just makes me so upset that we spent so much time, so much wasted time with the Colin plot if they were going to basically end up together anyway. Now back at Vought, we see the 7 following the orders of Homelander as they take out the employees on the hit list. We see Firecracker shoots a guy, we see the Deep kills a guy by punching him in the face, and we ultimately see that Noir kills the other Ashley as he gets his
murder boner.
As his journey to become the Black Noir continues. Now back with Butcher, Mallory, and Ryan, we see Mallory telling Ryan the truth about his father Homelander. as she spills the beans about the assassination plan, but also she tells him about Flight 37. Now Ryan doesn't believe anything that Mallory is telling him until she tells him about the truth about what Homelander did to his mom. Now that the cat's out of the bag, as they tell him about their ultimate plan, which is to have Ryan be trained to kill his own father in Homelander. Now Ryan wants to take a moment to take all this in and wants to take a moment outside, but unfortunately we see that they apply the pressure on him as Ryan realizes that this whole area is secured and meant to hold a Soup as powerful as he is, and if he doesn't agree, they're gonna lock him in. Now in the last ditch effort, we see Mallory brings up her grandkids and how Ryan has basically helped her through her grief of loss of losing her grandkids, and basically he's become family to her. But again, Ryan doesn't want to hear that. He just wants to take a moment for himself, but we watch as Mallory begins to back away and she's about to press the button to lock them in. Unfortunately for her, we see that Ryan pushes her so hard, very similar to what he did to stuntman Quaid as he kills Mallory and leaves. Which is the moment that Joe's been waiting for and what he's been telling him this whole season, as we see Butcher is now allowing Joe to take full control. As we end this episode, we head into the meeting with Vic, and the plan right now is pretty simple. As Vought and Homelander is what she agreed to do to help the boys and take them out, but unfortunately, Daddy's home. Looking like he's been brought back to the dead, we see Butcher calls off this deal as Hughie wants him to trust him like he did with his younger brother Lenny, but unfortunately that was the old Butcher and in with the new Butcher as we see him pushing Hughie aside and he knocks out Zoe. He lifts up Vic in the air and wraps his murderous arm tentacles around her and rips Vic apart. And this honestly kind of pisses me off because I'm such a big fan of Vic and I feel like she was so wasted this season. Skip all the Kimiko, Frenchie, Hughie, Dad, Mom crap, the Annie crap. We should have gotten so many more scenes with Vic and dealing with the whole thing of her being this Soup who doesn't want to get outed, her giving her daughter the V to protect herself, her letting her dad or pseudo dad out and stand. Like there could have been so many more things to explore with Vic. I feel like she was just wasted and I hate that they killed her off, but that's just me. Let me know what you all think about this final moment with Vic. Did she deserve this moment, or did you all, like me, want her to have more to do in the final season? Now the boys are ready to die, but they let Butcher take the virus as he leaves and smiles and tells the boys,
"Oh, by the way, you're all fucking welcome."
Leaving us with the potential setup of the final season with the boys versus Homelander and Vought and now Butcher. As the news is out about Vic's death, we see that Homelander is yet again broken as his plans have completely went to shit as we see Sage walks in to celebrate. As she tells him, yes, there were a few screwballs, but seamlessly this was all a part of her grand plan. As we also see the news breaking that the president was behind Vic's death and they also associate the boys with helping him, which was recorded by the shapeshifter. Now with Singer arrested, this leaves the president's seat wide open for
House Calhoun. Once they invoke the 25th, he's next in line to be president. He'd like to pledge his allegiance to you.
As Sage tells Homelander that she kept her end of the promise and that she's got his back, and the reason she did all this is because she wanted to see if she could do it, which she did obviously, as she thanks him and leaves with her notebook and tells Homelander,
you know, next time, listen to me.
Next time?
Hells yeah, blonde ambition. Love for phase 2.
As the United States of Homelander has begun, we see the end of this episode showing the members of the boys going their separate ways into hiding. As Homelander sends his armies of Soups after them and tells the people of America,
America will be safe again. Today, a new age of superheroes begins.
As one by one, we see the boys getting taken in. But first, we see Firecracker still the host of the Truth Bomb and seems to be okay with her health as we watch Zoe gets taken into the Red River. Now, starting with Annie and Hughie, we see that Annie finally got her powers back, which is perfect timing because as they're driving on the road, we see this boat being thrown in the middle of the road as Hughie gets taken away from Annie, and we finally get the return of Sydney, who we haven't seen since back in season 2. As Annie's choosing to fight to live another day, we see that she finally is able to take flight as she's been practicing to do that this whole season as she flies in the sky and manages to escape. As we see Frenchie and Kimiko attempt to abort a ship, but they're attacked by Kate and Sam as they get separated as well, but we also see in this moment Kimiko speaks and screams out to Frenchie for the first time this entire show as we see Frenchie's under the control of Kate. I'm not gonna lie, for a second there, I thought that Kate was gonna maybe have Frenchie like unalive himself. Again, I wasn't the biggest fan of Frenchie this season, but I'm glad to see that he will continue on the next season and see where it goes. But honestly, if they would have had Kate kill him right then and there, that would have been pretty dark. Meanwhile, we see MM's in the bathroom, and he was probably most likely headed to his family as he gets knocked out by the same soup from Herogasm. As our last shot of season 4 shows Butcher on the road with Joe in the back seat as he's got the virus headed to make things right, or at least right in his own head, by killing Homelander. Not quite done yet with this episode. We get a mid-credit scene which shows Calhoun takes Homelander to who I think Sage may have been talking about last week when she mentioned that he's not able to defeat that one person, and it seems to be that one person she was referring to is Soldier Boy, who's still on ice. As we watch, Homelander stands over and looks down at his dad, as we see this look of confusion on Homelander's face, and it's all in his eyes. Now the question is, does he want to kill his dad? Does he want to defeat that one person that Sage may have been talking about? Or does he try to have that father and son relationship that he's always wanted? Either way, I'm a big Soldier Boy fan. I feel like this season sorely missed that character, so I'm excited to see that Soldier Boy will hopefully, fingers crossed, have a much bigger role in season 5. Before we get into my thoughts about season 5, just giving my general impression about this finale, I thought it was the best episode in the last few weeks, but honestly that doesn't say that much because I thought those other episodes weren't that great, and also I do know that those episodes were being the setup. It was leading all to this. Now, as far as the first 30 minutes of this particular finale, I'll be honest, I thought it was lackluster, but luckily the last 30 minutes is what I've been wishing for this whole season, and I wish this whole season would have had this type of stakes and this type of intensity, but unfortunately it didn't. Now, positively speaking about this finale, as I mentioned before, I was a big fan of Evil Annie. That was fun to watch. I always love seeing the craziness that Ashley finds her in, but now her being a soup is very intriguing, and also seeing Vic getting ripped in half by the evil Butcher, and the last 5 minutes of the boys being taken in by Kate and Sam was great to see. But putting that aside, I'll be honest, this last episode is an example of how this whole season just felt like one giant setup for the 5th and final season of The Boys. I look at all the themes and the character arcs this season, and I can't help but to find just a few that served this particular season and wasn't just filler to waiting for the final season of this show. I think of characters like Hughie getting his mom back in his life just to lose his dad, and all the terrible stuff we saw him go through, but it didn't have a payoff in this particular season. I mean, on a lesser degree, you could say the same thing about Annie, who was going through her identity crisis, which I felt was undercooked, and her having this whole bizarro self that she had to take out, again, just felt underwhelming for me personally. Now, I've said it before, I'm a big fan of MM, that's my boy, but his plot, what exactly was it? Like, they bring up the whole daughter thing and the whole stepdad thing, but they take that out in the first episode, so what was MM's point? Like, yes, he was in charge for most of the season, but then he gave it back to Butcher, then Butcher gave it back to him. Again, I just feel like the show forgotten what to do with MM this season. Now, I've already spoke on Frenchie and Kimiko in this episode and previous episodes, but y'all already know how I feel. Their whole plots was just a waste of time. And don't even get me started on Sage Master Plan, which was just so underwritten in my opinion. The deep and noir in their bromance was just kind of throwaway. It was just meant for like levity and comedy of the show. And look, speaking of the show, I don't want to sound like I'm a hater. I love The Boys. That's why I watch it every week. That's why I do these breakdowns every week. But I gotta admit, yes, it's fun seeing those shocking, gross, hilarious moments, and they were highlighted throughout these last 8 weeks. And again, I've brought them up in all my breakdowns, but I personally feel that this was easily the worst season of The Boys so far. The people that have criticized this season about being too woke or too political, they're crazy to me, because this show has been political since the very first episode. But as far as my personal opinion, when it comes to the more focused political plot, the more of the presidential plot that we got this season, obviously, regardless of if you're a left side or the right side, this show was very one-sided with their satire, and it was very one-note, and it just lacked the depth and the cleverness from the previous seasons. The only characters to me that were handled in a way that had some remnants of the old times were characters like Vic, even though, like, again, I feel like they were so underused this season. I think of someone like Butcher. Now, again, the whole Joe thing was pretty obvious for a lot of us, but I did like what we got from Butcher, and even though Homelander Homelander is the worst person in the world. He's my favorite villain on TV, as I've said many times. But there's even moments that I think about Homelander and how I kind of feel disappointed because, as I said a couple weeks ago, the whole 4th episode, I want to say, when he had his whole reborn of like removing his humanity, what was the point of that episode? Because as we saw as the following episodes, he was pretty much the same Homelander. He was forgiving people. He was letting people kind of take advantage of him in a sense. So that whole 4th episode just kind of fell on deaf ears to me personally. I will give some love to A-Train and his redemption arc this season. I'm kind of torn on Ryan because yes, I like where they send the character and how they set him up at the end of this episode, which kind of opens the door for that satisfying fight with his dad or Butcher or his granddad and Soldier Boy. But besides moments like this in the finale, Ryan was kind of forgotten about for most of the second half in the middle of this season. But the saving grace to me in this very underwritten show as far as this season goes, I love the performances. Like, even though they were saying some ridiculous stuff, they were out of character for most of the season, at least in my opinion, and also a lot of the plots felt recycled. I love these actors, and I think they do such a great job. I know Antony Starr gets most of the praise, but across the board to me, all these actors do great in their roles, even if their characters aren't written the same like they used to be. Now, those are my thoughts about the finale and also just the season as a whole, which leads me into everything we know so far about the last and final season of The Boys. Now, first and foremost, you can find the article that I'm going to highlight in the description of this video, but let's talk about when we can expect the 5th season. Now, according to the creator, Eric Kripke, he talked about that the 5th season is currently now being written as when this story was released, and they plan to shoot the 5th and final season with 8 episodes, and it's going to start in November of this year and go through the mid of 2025, which most likely puts the return of the 5th and final season at the earliest, at the very end. I'm talking about like December 31st of 2025 at the earliest, but most likely to finish the visual effects, to get any cameos they want to have on board and all the actors on board. I could see the return happening around the same time that we got the start of this 4th season, and it'll probably be out by the spring or end of the summer of 2026. Now, as far as the story goes with this 5th and final season, again, the creator talked about that Butcher and Homelander and these two planets clashing together is the central plot. That particular story will come to an end in the 5th and final season, so there won't be like this big cliffhanger, at least they say that now, but the idea is to have Butcher and Homelander finally go toe-to-toe. Now, with the end of The Boys being in season 5, the door is still open for more seasons of Gen V, and also the spinoff of The Boys is going to take place in Mexico. Now, honestly, I'm glad The Boys will be ending in season 5 because I felt like this season in particular, like I said earlier, has felt like recycled material, and we've seen these storylines and plots before, and it's kind of losing its steam and momentum. But I'm not going to lie, I am super excited for more seasons of Gen V because I'm such a big fan of that show, and I'm really excited to see what's going to happen with our crew and where they are, where they're locked up in. And I would imagine most of the Gen V cast will probably be involved with the 5th and final season, and more than likely will be teaming up with The Boys to take out again Butcher and Homelander and Vought. Now, there hasn't been a ton of details about the Mexico series, but I'm curious to see what that has to do. Like, I'm very curious to know if this spinoff is going to be after Gen V Season 2 to kind of make a filler season before they finish The Boys Season 5, or will we have to wait to Gen V Season 2, which I believe will be coming out next year, then we have The Boys 5th and final season, and then we get the spinoff, and the spinoff will be based on the aftermath of what happens with Gen V Season 2 and what happens with The Boys Season 5. So I'm going to wrap up this video by saying this. Season 5 has the opportunity to correct what I thought were the wrongs in Season 4 and go back to the good writing, not worried about all these setups and these half-baked ideas, just go balls to the wall. For example, we got Ashley, who's now a soup, who can maybe team up with A-Train, who they might actually get members from Gen V to help find the boys who was taken by Homelander's army. And again, we get these final showdowns with all these big characters, but the big one that I think we're all been waiting for, and I'm excited to see, which again would be Butcher, Ryan, Homelander, and most likely now Soldier Boy. Alright, after me going on and on and on, it is your turn to let me know your thoughts on this finale, but also share your overall thoughts of this season in general. And of course, I want to know your thoughts and your theories or predictions of what's to come in the next and final season of The Boys, but also what do you hope to see in Gen V, and also whatever this Mexico spinoff is going to be as well. Before calling it a wrap, I want to take the time to thank you all for anyone that's been watching either one video, or if you watched all of my breakdowns for the last 8 weeks. I can't thank you enough. Keep an eye out for a video I'm going to be making that's going to be combining all the breakdowns into this one giant recap. Again, thank you all for the continued support. Check out my playlist of all my boys coverage. You all have been awesome. Stay safe, and I'll catch you all on the next breakdown.